A balmy summer evening in an isolated rural garden, so deep in the countryside that one could no longer hear any trace of distant traffic, nor see any telltale scar of light pollution on the horizon. Poised on the cusp of true night as if frozen in time, the setting sun reduced to a faint suggestion on the far side of the darkening hills, the silence of the shadows broken only by the chirping of hidden insects. Sitting on a weathered stone bench outside a lovely little thatched cottage, lit from behind by soft electric glow, beside a woman whom I loved very deeply even if I wasn't exactly certain as to the exact and proper form of that love. A year ago I would have given my left hand to be blessed by such a dreamlike scene. Romantic fantasy had failed, however, to account for the more earthy realities such as the piles of half-collapsed scaffolding and burst chicken wire which surrounded the otherwise picturesque cottage. And Preem the demon maid, methodically digging up most of the garden to ruin the magical design scored into the lawn. And of course not to forget Zheng, 8 feet of rippling muscle looming behind us in the darkness, our implicit bodyguard, an ever-present reminder of our need to command and wield terrible violence at a moment's notice. So, all in all, it was not actually a very romantic situation whatsoever. The sheer weight of Evelyn's cold anger also didn't help. She used anger to fortify herself against the reality of the supernatural truth, but also against her own fears and vulnerability in worry for her friends, and against the humiliations of constant pain. Evelyn's body was a litany of long-term problems with no good solutions, not only her prosthetic leg and the chronic pain it caused in her hips and her stump, but also the less obvious disabilities of her missing fingers and her kinked spine, not to mention the hidden damage she so rarely spoke about, or the painkiller addiction we so delicately avoided acknowledging most of the time. Those of us close to her, we understood that when Evelyn went off on one, she didn't really mean it. Not really. Not like that. It meant that she cared too much, or hurt too much, or was too scared, and couldn't express herself in any other way. Sitting on that stone bench in that garden in Devon, Evelyn's cold fury bored into my flesh, hollowed me out, and wrapped a shaking, terrified grip around my soul. I'd been an idiot and nearly walked into a trap. Evelyn was so afraid that she was ready to hurt me at least emotionally in order to stop me from ever doing that again. I didn't know what was worse, Evelyn's anger itself, or her theory that Edward's trap had been aimed at me personally. At least with Edward, I could just kill him when I found him. I blinked the gathering tears out of my eyes, sniffing loudly and trying to hold myself together in front of Evie. My pink hoodie, my favorite, my beloved gift from Rain, was currently hundreds of miles away back in Sherrowford, and also still sopping wet with outsider swamp water. So, in rather poetic fashion, I was currently wearing the hoodie that Evelyn had bought me, dark pink, with diamond-shaped scale patterns on the shoulders and upper arms, hood and zipper trimmed in white. I always tried to avoid getting this one dirty, but I had nowhere else to scrub my eyes, so I wiped my face on my sleeve. Crying. I croaked, sniffing back more tears. A little bit. Ah, Evelyn said. I'd rarely heard her sound so awkward. I'm sorry, Evie. I'm so sorry. I spoke to the night, to the distant hills, to the shadowy outline of Preem still digging in the garden. My tentacles reeled in tight and wrapped around my core, like pneumosomatic armor, trying to quash the shaking in my chest. Not as if Evelyn had accepted my touch earlier, anyway. You're right, I got overwhelmed by the situation. When I found Natalie outside everything Edward has to die, but I'm sorry. I should have waited. I should have been sensible. A small hiccup climbed up my throat. I'm supposed to be sensible. Sensible good girl Heather. Another small hiccup. So much for that. Lost control of myself. Evelyn sighed a deep sigh. For a moment I heard her grinding her teeth. No, I should be. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Heather. I lost my temper with you. You've a right to. Another sigh, sharp this time. Evelyn tapped the ground with the tip of her walking stick. I'm taking my frustration out on you and you don't deserve it. Edward got away. Our quarry escaped. Which pisses me off. He tried to, well, not murder you, but do something else, I don't know what, not yet. If I had him here right now, I do believe I would be torturing him. Zheng purred with grim approval from behind us. I turned and blinked at Evelyn, a cold feeling creeping through my veins and up my throat. I caught her in profile against the night, outlined in shadow by the harsh lights from the exterior of the cottage, strands of loose blonde hair against the star-strewn sky above. Her puppy-fat cheeks, her little nose, the hard stare in her eyes. Evelyn say the mage, ready to commit atrocity in my name. Evie. No, I didn't mean. That's not true, Evie. I took a deep breath and started to unravel my tentacles. Evelyn wasn't so scary anymore. I smiled an awkward smile, then reached over with one hand and gently placed it atop her own, both of which were curled tight around the handle of her walking stick. Her hands were cold, with focus or adrenaline or anger. She almost flinched, but then swallowed and accepted my touch. It took me a good few seconds to realize what I'd said. Evelyn gave me a look of alarmed skepticism. Preem paused in her digging work, straightened up, and stared at us across the garden. Zheng hissed a long sound between her teeth, like the noise a tiger might make if it could laugh. Eventually Evelyn found her voice again. Heather, that doesn't mean what you think it does. But I was already blushing, raising both hands in apologetic surrender, spluttering like a broken steam engine. I am sorry. I didn't mean it like that. I don't usually use language like that, so I didn't think. I didn't think. Evidently not. Evelyn was blushing too, and frowning at Preem. The doll demon was finally lifting her spade with both hands and crossing the broken lawn to join us. Probably to tease me mercilessly for my Freudian slip. I hurried to explain. What I meant is that no matter how grumpy you get, or combative you are, or. Yes, Heather, I get it. I get it. Evelyn spoke to the ground, staring very hard at the grass, as if it might reveal my secrets to her. Evelyn cleared her throat. Yes, Heather. I get it. I understand what you intended to say, even if you use questionable terminology with which to say it. I pulled a very awkward smile. Again, sorry. No, it's all right. And thank you. Evelyn sighed heavily and rubbed the bridge of her nose. But we are very lucky Rain didn't hear you say that, we'd never live it down. Preem finally joined us. She drew to a halt a few paces from Evelyn's other side and clinked the blade of the shovel against the stones of the overgrown pathway. Her black and white maid outfit was still perfectly starched, the lace clean and smooth, hem unblemished by the work of turning over all that dirt. How she did it, I have no idea. Evelyn glared a very cold glare at her. Preem, you know that I love you unconditionally, but if you repeat this incident to Rain I'll. Preem stared back. We all knew there was nothing Evelyn could credibly threaten her with. Evie settled on something. I shall invite you to a marathon watch party of the worst anime I can think of. Something truly diabolical. And not one of those, so bad it's funny, ones, either. Something painful. It'll hurt me more than it hurts you. Very scary, said Preem. Evelyn huffed, but the matter was settled. Silence descended for a moment. I was so exhausted by the events of the day that I just wanted to lean on Evie's shoulder and close my eyes, beneath this quiet sky between the shadowed hills. I was still frazzled from the shambler, from Edward, from saving little Natalie. But delayed action fear gnawed in the pit of my guts, not to mention guilt. I reached over with a tentacle and gently wrapped it around Evelyn's forearm. She flinched from the invisible touch, but then realized it was me and tooted. Sorry, I murmured. Just wanted to hug. It's all right, go on, she grumbled. Slowly and gently, I slid a second tentacle across her shoulders and a third around her waist. That was a riskier gamble. Evelyn always had problems with people touching her back. Her spine was so sensitive, it was so easy to squeeze her in the wrong way, so difficult to get it right. But she sighed and leaned into my touch, allowing me to take her weight on the bench. Zheng finally left her post behind us, stalking off to examine the ruins of the magic circle on the lawn. Perhaps she considered Preem an effective enough bodyguard by herself. 8 feet of zombie muscle ghosted through the deepening dark. Besides, I said with a little sigh, I think you were justified in getting angry with me, Evie. I totally lost control of myself back inside that kitchen. I'm sorry, really. And don't tell me to not be sorry. Evelyn gave me an odd look, then nodded. Please, just practice better self-preservation. I would say, I don't know what came over me, but that would be a lie. I was just so angry with Edward. Building a cage for Lozzie, tricking us, kidnapping a little girl like that, leaving her to die outside. Anger flared up inside my chest, like embers revealed in the heart of a burned-out bonfire, but lacking the hot urgency of action. Edward wasn't nearby, my prey had escaped, so the anger was all intellectual and emotional now. Unmixed with the instinctive hunting drive I'd brought back from the abyss. Yes, Evelyn said slowly. I suspect that was intentional. I'm sorry. Evelyn gestured at the ruined circle, the overturned dirt, the severed copper wire. Making you angry, to lure you into this. Why would he need to make me angry? You don't think he chose Natalie on purpose, to get to me somehow? That idea did occur to me, but it seems absurd, too specific. Evelyn shook her head, but I kept going, because her suggestion didn't make sense. He plucked me right out of a slip, why not just have me step directly into this? He could have dumped me right on top of it. I don't have all the answers, Evelyn said. However much it pains me to admit that. Well, do you have a theory? Evelyn glanced at me sidelong, a twinkle in her eyes, a subtle smile on her lips, smug and knowing. There was my beautiful strategist. Preem answered for her, a theory is had. Evelyn cleared her throat. Before we get to that, how is the girl? Lozzie is messaging you, right? Somebody's staying in contact with her. My phone's broken, I sighed. But Rain gave me hers for the moment. Here. I hadn't mentioned it earlier in all the commotion, certainly not in the face of Evie's anger, but Lozzie had sent a text message and a photograph, while I'd been sitting on the bench and zoned out of my own mind. I fumbled Rain's mobile phone out of my pocket and pulled up the message to reassure Evelyn. The picture showed Natalie fast asleep on Lozzie's bed, clean of outsider swamp mud, dressed in oversized clothes borrowed from Lozzie and curled up with an equally sleeping Tenny. The girl was wrapped in about half a dozen of Tenny's black tentacles. That boded very well for her state of mind. I could think of no better way to disarm supernatural terror than to be introduced to Tenny. With a bit of luck she would remember the strange tentacle friend who made happy trilling noises, and remember less about the hours lost and alone, outside. Lozzie's face was visible in the corner of the picture, peering into the frame, horribly out of focus. She was making a V sign with her fingers. Wish I'd had a Tenny, I said with a sad little smile. But Evelyn went almost white in the face. Heather, delete that picture. Right now. Ah. Preem obeyed as if she'd read Evelyn's mind. She deftly plucked the phone from my hands, her own fingers already flying across the screen to delete the picture and send a message to Lozzie. Evie. I don't. Done, Preem intoned. Lozzie, informed. Images, deleted. I blinked several times. But we're gonna return her to her parents. Yes, Evelyn sighed. And I'm sure that excuse will hold up in court. No pictures of the kidnapped girl, at all. Can't believe I have to explain this. Until she's off our hands, she is radioactive. TCH. I felt very silly for several moments. Evelyn sighed and patted my arm awkwardly. Preem hung on to the phone, briefly tapping out a follow-up message to Lozzie. So, I ventured. Evie, your theory. About the circle. Evelyn settled herself more comfortably on the stone bench, though she did wince, even with the support of my tentacles. A cold stone slab was no proper place for her delicate backside, and I reminded myself not to let us linger here longer than needed. When she spoke again, it was Evelyn the teacher, comfortable and practiced. I could tell she had briefly rehearsed some of these thoughts, probably while sketching and photographing Edward's mysterious magic circle. "Of course I have a theory, though it is only a theory," she said. "I am making an educated guess based on the structure of the circle and the rough position of the contents." She glanced over our shoulders at the cottage, wrapped in layers of ruined chicken wire, all bent and burst. "And also from Edward Lilburn's behavior." I nodded along, my mouth going dry, but my mind waking up. This was Evelyn at her best, her sharpest, her most impressive. "Go on." Evie wet her lips with a flicker of pink tongue. "I suspect that your emotional state may have formed an important part of this spell, whatever it was." She nodded at the churned dirt of the lawn. "Possibly it required you to charge into the circle without noticing it first. The circle back in the kitchen, the one where he was sitting, that may also have been a component. It was bait, you were meant to appear on top of it. All of us being present, that may have interrupted whatever process the smaller component was meant to catalyze. But what was it catalyzing?" Evelyn frowned at me for a moment, darkly concerned. "The circle itself is a kind of cage, an enclosure." She gestured left and right along the wall of the cottage and the edge of the ruined Faraday cage. The corners were barely visible beyond the arc of the outdoor lights. "There's no way to leave the building without entering the circle. The back door, the front door, either would lead you into the area of effect. And the circle is very carefully hidden in the grass, as we found. You'd be several feet into it before you noticed, charging out of either door. What about if I had climbed through a window, or smashed a hole in the wall?" Evelyn finished for me, then shook her head. "You'd still step right into it." She sighed and glanced up at the thatched roof behind us. "I think going straight up might have worked as an escape route, going high enough to avoid the circle's area of effect, but you wouldn't have known that." "I also can't fly," I said with a little laugh. "I'm not a superhero." Evelyn gave me the briefest of doubtful glances. My heart skipped a beat, but she carried on before I could say anything. "Slipping wouldn't have worked either, of course. Not inside that Faraday cage. That was part of the trap." "Right, of course." "Oh." I frowned in deeper confusion. "Wait, no, the shambler slipped me out the first time. My slip didn't work, but hers did." "Exactly," Evelyn grumbled. "Ah." Evelyn closed her eyes and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Slow down, Heather, let me explain the theory. Edward summons you here, correct? Then he makes impossible demands, obstinate demands, ones that will obviously make you angry. He demands Lozzie, and he gives you no proper explanation. Doesn't it seem like his intent was to make you angry, on purpose?" I suppose so." "Do you mean he doesn't really want Lozzie, after everything he's said and done?" "His intentions for Lozzie are beside the point. You spoke to him, I'm just working from what you've told me. Think back, and think carefully. Does it seem possible he was trying to make you angry?" I stared out at the hills around the cottage, now blanketed with soft night, beneath a sky thick with stars. The suggestion of sunset was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Zheng had vanished too, somewhere behind the trees or the overgrown weed-choked flower beds. I cast my mind back to the conversation with Edward, an old man perched in a little wooden chair. He hadn't acted smug or domineering or as if he had something to prove or convince me of, just bluntly confident in his superiority. He had made me angry, unspeakably so, but not as angry as I'd been after discovering Natalie, lost and alone in that outsider swamp. "Maybe," I said eventually. "I don't know." Then, Evelyn continued, "he has the shambler take you away to her muddy wallow, where you find human corpses. And Natalie. And Natalie, yes, I'm getting to that. Listen, Heather, he may have even known that the shambler wouldn't actually eat either of them. You said she hadn't, correct? I nodded. Yes. The body of the young man, he was almost completely intact. I blinked and swallowed. Sorry, Evie, thinking about it is kinda vile. He needs a proper burial, whoever he was. His family, they'll be missing him. Nobody knows. Just bear with me, Evelyn said. To my surprise, she patted the tentacle that I had currently wrapped around her arm, even though she couldn't see it. Locating me by touch alone. So, either you were going to find a dead young man and a dead little girl or a live little girl, terrified and alone, outside. From Edward's perspective the details didn't matter. You get enraged, angry, you lose control. He's pressing your buttons. Then you come back here, full of very justified anger, and try to ambush him in that kitchen. But he'd moved. I nodded along. He figured out we'd do that. No, Evelyn said, in the exact tone of a very patient professor with a student who was missing an obvious point. No. Heather, think about it. He wanted you run out into the garden, to complete the next step of the spell. I would wager he left that chair the moment the shambler took you away. He knew you would think of the ambush, he set himself up or his vessel as bait, for you. Ah, yes. I cleared my throat awkwardly. Right, I see. So, you slipped back, right into his magic circle in the kitchen. Now, whatever that was meant to do, it didn't work. It was inert the moment we arrived, and I think I know why. Why? Evelyn allowed herself a thin smile. You brought all of us with you. Oh. Yes, I suppose I did, didn't I? I think he expected you to find 2 corpses in that swamp, then get angry, maybe kill the shambler, and then slip back right on top of his chair, to kill him. I don't think he expected the little girl to survive. If he had, he would have accounted for the possibility you would have dropped her off at home first, and then returned with reinforcements. That circle, whatever it was attuned to you, personally. But you brought us along, and our presence broke it. I squeezed her arm. Good. In theory, anyway. I think his plan was to get you angry, get you into that smaller circle, and then have you run out into the garden into the larger circle, this monstrosity here, whatever exit you took, since you wouldn't be able to slip. Evelyn frowned. Though he got that wrong too. He underestimated you. Well, he underestimated hyperdimensional mathematics. I sighed. I tend to do that too, I don't know my own limits. Quite. I took a deep breath and did my best to stop thinking for a moment, to absorb what this all meant. I turned my eyes from Evelyn and stared into the thickening darkness of this summer night. A shadow moved by the rear garden wall, too tall to be a human being, avoiding the lights from the house Cheng, carrying out one final check for any clues we might have missed. I didn't have much hope for that. Evie, I asked, what do you think he was trying to do to me? What was this huge magic circle actually for? Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, rubbing at her thigh where socket met flesh. She spoke slowly, as if her own thoughts left a sour taste in her mouth. I don't know for certain. I don't think he was trying to kill you, or the rest of us either. Like I said, a simple bomb would have done the trick for that. No, I don't think he was trying to kill you. Evelyn was frowning at the ruined circle upon the lawn, her eyes ringed with dark stress lines, her jaw clenched hard, her brow furrowed deep. On the far side of her, a few paces from the bench, Preem stared down at both of us. But that's not the end of the theory, I said. It wasn't a question. For a moment Evelyn didn't answer, couldn't answer. She looked like a stone carving of vengeance itself. I don't know, she said. This circle, it's the traditions he's used for it, I'm not familiar with them. Some parts of it are very complex, yes, very much beyond my knowledge, that part is obvious. But the overall structure is like a A familiar purr interrupted us from the darkness. A blood funnel. Zheng stalked out of the shadows behind Preem, which was quite a feat considering the wide coverage of the outdoor lights. She seemed to step out of nowhere, unfolding like a panther dropping from a hidden branch and landing on the jungle floor with silent paws. The heat of the summer night and the drone of insects did nothing to dispel the gut impression of being ambushed by some massive predatory feline. I flinched, all my tentacles flexing outward, except the three wrapped around Evelyn. Evie jerked as well, but then huffed in exasperation, glaring at Zheng. Preem merely turned and stared. Zheng. I forced a deep breath down my throat, trying to slow my racing heart. Blood funnel? What do you mean? Zheng blinked slowly, exactly like a giant cat in some steaming jungle. A funnel, with grooves cut to channel blood. Evelyn's frown turned sharp as Zheng's teeth. How do you know that? Zheng gestured with one slow hand at the remains of the circle across the lawn, the piles of ruined copper wire cut into pieces by Preem's spade, the strange design that Edward Lilburn had tried to get me to step inside. Rope and steel, gutting knives, channels for blood, a bucket for collection. The shape is clear. How do you know the first thing about magic? Evelyn demanded. Zheng rolled her neck. I know how to kill and drain a pig, wizard. Ha, Evelyn grunted. Wait, pardon. I squinted in confusion. You're saying he was going to drain my blood? Evelyn sighed. Not literally, no. But metaphorically. Spiritually. I don't know. All I know is that, yes, Zheng is right, at least that's what it looks like to my knowledge. A magical version of a funnel for collecting blood from a victim, pooling it at a central point. She shot Zheng a dubious look, openly suspicious. Zheng rumbled in return, showing all her teeth but without any hint of a smile. Wizard, if I knew the littlest thing about this insult to the shaman, would not keep it to myself. But to my incredible surprise, Evelyn neither flinched nor shied away. She stared back into Zheng's sharp-edged eyes, right at that naked maw of shark teeth. Preem stood between them, but for once she seemed to form no barrier at all. I wet my lips and found I was quivering slightly. I tried to speak Zheng's name, to tell her to back down, but my throat was closing up. Edward had wanted to drain my blood. What did that mean, even as a metaphor? All right, Evelyn said softly. Her voice snapped me back to myself. All right, Zheng. Sometimes I forget we're on the same side. My apologies. Zheng grunted. Didn't sound like she was going to reciprocate the apology. I swallowed hard and tried to gather my thoughts. I don't get it, drain my blood. I know he wanted to learn how to slip, I told you. At least I think that's what he meant. But he was going to do what? Take it from me. You have a theory, Preem said, but she was talking to Zheng. Zheng blinked slowly again, as if considering whether she should speak at all. But she broke when I looked up at her. Old magic, Zheng purred. Excuse me, said Evelyn. Old magic. Older than your scribbling and whining, your wizard tricks and word traps and overthinking the world. Old magic. Drink the blood, steal the soul. I just shook my head, feeling horribly numb as I stared out at the ruined magic circle beneath the lawn of the cottage. This was the sort of dark madness I'd imagined when I'd first learned of magic, the only thing missing was a bloody stone altar. I almost laughed, but hiccuped instead. I don't understand, I said. What does he want? Hyperdimensional mathematics. It would kill him. My abyssal self. He was obsessed with purity, that wasn't a lie, so why would he want that? Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to suggest some theory, some rationalization. But Zheng crossed the few paces which separated us, resuming her place at my back, and placed one warm hand on the top of my head. Do not waste energy on understanding wizards, shaman, she purred. Better to tear out their tongues before they speak. I sighed and tried to find the comfort in those words, reaching up with a tentacle and wrapping it around Zheng's arm. But the sentiment left me cold. I already understood this wizard. There was only one possible conclusion. Edward Lilburn had attempted to steal something from me, either my abyssal nature, or dubious bond with the lessons with the eye, or something more fundamental, something I'd failed to understand all these years since the eye had kidnapped Maisie and myself. He wanted to render me down for my blood. He didn't want me, he wanted what I was. To drain me, like a pig in a slaughterhouse. Meat. Can't have it, I whispered. Something horrible and dark turned inside my stomach. For the first time in my life, I considered going vegetarian. But nobody had heard my whisper. Evelyn was scoffing with exaggerated offense. "Oh, thank you very much," she said to Zheng. "No tongues," Preem added. Zheng looked down at them, dark eyes against the star-strewn sky. She grunted. "Present company accepted," I said for her. "I'm sure." Evelyn rolled her eyes, but then turned her attention to me. "Heather, whatever Edward was doing, we won't let him do it. Not to you or to Lozzie. This circle is ruined, we've destroyed it, and we have his machine. I'll study it and find out how it works. We're not going to let him do this. I will not let him do this. That's what I meant about changing our strategy." I nodded, squeezed her arm, and tried to look at the overturned dirt of the lawn without feeling like a lamb before a bombed-out slaughterhouse. We fell silent for a long moment. Zheng kept her hand on top of my head for a few seconds, then withdrew it and stalked away a little distance, peering around the side of the house, looking for any hidden watchers. Preem stepped over to the house and laid the spade against the wall of the cottage. Evelyn sighed and glanced up at the dark windows. Lights shone deeper inside, probably in one of the front bedrooms. As we watched, one light went out and another went on. Somebody crossed one of the windows' twill, in the middle of saying something, as she and Rain finished their double-check inside the cottage. "Wish those two would hurry up and be done with this," Evelyn hissed. "We need to be away from here." Words bubbled up before I could stop myself. Zheng and Preem were both well within earshot, but somehow that didn't matter. I rode a wave of exhaustion, fear, and salvation too, knowing that this strange moment would end very soon. If I didn't stand up and shout now, I never would. "Evie," I said, looking right at her, "I love you too." Evelyn frowned at me. Heather, what? I mean, back in the cottage, when I was losing control, you said, 'I love you,' and then you got mad at me. Which is what I needed somebody to get me under control. But, Evie, I love you too. I love you." Why were those words so easy to say? Why had I been agonizing all this time? Was I really so exhausted and out of my mind that I could simply admit it out loud? My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't shaking, no pounding of nervous adrenaline racked my head and chest. I was perfectly calm. Evelyn Say, my best friend, the woman I'd saved from outside before I'd even understood what outside was, a woman I perhaps knew better than I knew my own lover, stared back at me with those soft blue eyes set in that puppy-fat face, arched an eyebrow, and said, "Yes." I blinked 3 times. "Why yes?" "As in, yes, Heather, I love you too." Evelyn sighed, rolled her eyes, and patted the tentacle I had wrapped around her forearm. Like I was drunk and running my mouth, stating the obvious, a self-evident truth we both already knew. Then she looked back up at the cottage and sighed with impatience. I stared at Evie, dumbfounded. I must have looked totally gormless. My mouth half worked, trying to form extra words, to add a clarification, perhaps. Something like, "I mean I love you," or "No you don't get it," or "Evie, I'm confessing that I have confused quasi-romantic feelings for you and they're coming out in the wake of a near-death experience and reliving my own childhood trauma by projecting it onto a small child whom I saved from certain death by exposure and/or starvation. Please acknowledge the depth of my affection and regard for you. I had absolutely zero idea what was going on. Heather Morel, captain of an emotional ghost ship, lost at sea, amid miles of fog bank, with no crew and a worrying gnawing sound echoing up from the hold. Was Evelyn hiding her real emotions, concealing them with a banal acknowledgement of our deep friendship? No, I couldn't believe that. Evelyn was nothing if not calculating. Despite her failures in the past, despite the way she insulted herself, she was a master of overthinking, but not when it came to me. I was the only one allowed all the way inside, past her defenses, to the secret room where she drew up her plots. Wasn't I? Or maybe she hadn't understood what I'd said, maybe she had the wrong end of the stick, maybe by saying those words, I was forcing her into an uncomfortable situation, and she was simply taking the easiest way out. But no, that made even less sense. Evelyn had trouble admitting her affection for her friends at the best of times. To simply say, so casually, the words, I love you, meant a lot to her. She'd screamed those words to me, once before. We hadn't discussed it, half because I'd pretended I hadn't heard them, and half because we'd had an entire crisis to deal with at the time. Down in the depths of Windless shell, when I'd been about to cross over the line of safety to accept his invasive parasite into my brain, into my soul, when Evelyn had briefly thought that Heather Morel would cease to exist, replaced by some outsider-ridden parasite thing, she'd screamed those words to my back. I love you too much, Heather. She'd only been able to say that because she'd thought I was about to die. To my back. Almost drowned out by the booming air displacement of Windless tentacles. How could I not have heard those words? I'd just been trying not to acknowledge them this whole time. And she had just repeated it as the most casual thing in the world. Had Evie found the emotional time and space to think about those words? Had her screamed confession forced her into confronting what she felt or didn't feel? Had she already processed and accepted what we were to each other? She seemed so comfortable. Well, good for her. I, on the other hand, had a significantly less comprehensive understanding of the situation, to put it lightly. What I did have was 3 tentacles wrapped around Evelyn's body, one clutching her arm, one over her shoulders, and a 3rd tentacle looped around her waist. She was practically in my embrace, comfortable and casual in a way she was with nobody else, except maybe Preem. She was in my arms and had declared she loved me, and somehow this had made everything even less clear than before. For one mad, desperate moment, as she looked up at the lights in the cottage windows, I was gripped by a desire to kiss her on the cheek. But then I felt Preem's stare. A few paces from us, standing at an angle where Evelyn couldn't quite see, Preem was giving me the most intense stare I'd ever seen from the doll demon. She wasn't frowning, of course. Preem never did anything so overt as frown, except for that one time I'd asked her to smile, shortly after Evelyn had first created her. But her milk-white eyes were locked right on me, I could somehow tell, despite the lack of pupils and sclera and the heavy shadows of the summer night. Preem was staring at me with something akin to a warning. I stared back, trying to ask a silent question with my eyebrows. What am I doing wrong? Preem, help. To my incredible surprise, Preem nodded, then put a finger to her lips. For one dizzying moment I thought I'd developed telepathic powers. I don't blame myself for that, not after werewolves and spirits in parallel dimensions and moth girls and growing my own set of tentacles. But then Preem failed to respond to any of my follow-up thoughts, including the increasingly wild and outlandish ones which were intended solely to test if she could see what I was thinking. Some of those were so far beyond acceptability that even Preem would have needed to react, maybe even blush. I certainly did. But she didn't. She had been reacting to the look in my eyes, and perhaps to the way I was gazing at Evelyn. The moment passed. Evie sighed again and turned away from the cottage, then did a frowning double-take at me and shot a dubious glance at Preem over her shoulder. What are the pair of you doing behind my back? She tooted. This isn't the time for playing stupid games. Win stupid prizes, said Preem. Sorry. I blurted out. Sorry, I was just thinking about some stuff. And things. Nothing important. Evelyn gave me a doubtful look, then gestured at Preem with the head of her walking stick. Be a dear and fetch those two idiots inside, would you please? I doubt they're going to find anything by slitting open all the mattresses and pulling up the carpets. And we should get back to the house. There's no telling if Edward is trying to regroup right now, maybe to hit us here, or to follow up on some other plan. We need to be secure, and soon, and there's more work to do. Preem turned and marched into the cottage. A couple of minutes later all the lights inside went out. Rain and Twill emerged through the back door, with Preem right behind them. Jing appeared from the dark corners of the garden once again. Gang's all here, huh? Said Rain, a grin in her voice. She walked up behind us and squeezed my shoulder. Nothing doing in there, sadly. Not a trace. Might be a secret door somewhere, like an episode of Scooby-Doo, but I doubt it. You holding up okay, Heather? No. In various ways. Mostly, I lied. Shit's heavy, yo, said Twill. We goin'? Twill had Edward's slip-trap contraption in her arms. Werewolf strength rendered the weirdly shaped mass of steel and glass easy to carry. Preem had the LCD screens in a carrier bag and the broken laptop under one arm. Yes, Evelyn grunted. One moment. With some difficulty and some help from my tentacles Evelyn climbed to her feet and dusted off her backside. For a moment I felt terribly embarrassed at having her wrapped in my tentacles while everyone else was right here, but I told myself it was no different to give her some support after a long day. After all, Rain and Twill couldn't even see. This was just what friends did. Tentacle hugs. Friendly ones. Right. Twill peered out at the ruined garden. What we gonna do with the rest of the place? We're just leaving it like this. What was all this shit about, anyway? Evelyn sighed, planted her walking stick firmly on the cracked pathway, and narrowed her eyes at the cottage. We should really burn it down. Went Rain. The big grin suited her. Sometimes, Evie, you and I are working from the same page. What? Twill gaped. We can't do that. We can and we should, Evelyn grunted. Won't be the first time we've burned down a building. I cleared my throat softly. Yes, but that was a haunted house, haunted by the eye, I said. This is a beautiful old cottage. Evie, this might be some kind of listed building. It doesn't deserve that. Petrol, Preem intoned. Matches. Should be enough to get the job done. Evelyn regarded the cottage with heavy-lidded eyes and a painful, haunted hunch to her shoulders. When it comes to eradicating the work of mages, Heather, you never, ever leave anything to chance. Understand? She glanced at me, then back at the garden behind us, at the remains of the ruined magic circle. The garden too, it needs to be destroyed, completely. Hey, said Rain, a bright smile on her face. Can't help but notice that you're being totally serious here, Evie. Of course I'm serious. Have you changed your mind suddenly? Rain shook her head, laughed softly, and raised a hand, a gentle break on Evelyn's pyromania. When we torched the cult's house in Sherrowford, that was in the middle of a city, right? Plenty of neighbors around to raise the alarm when they saw smoke. Fire brigade right there, close at hand. Plus it was winter, in the north. Evelyn frowned at her. So, we're in rural Devon. Middle nowhere. Height summer. Ground's dry, grass is dry, hedgerows are dry. Think they've got a hosepipe ban on right now, yeah? Rain smiled all the wider, faux awkward as she made her case, but utterly confident beneath the act. If we set fire to this cottage, it could spread, fast, and there's not a lot of people to spot it. A fire like that could eat whole hillsides, other cottages, maybe threaten a village. A small fire, probably not, but we're talking about dumping enough petrol on this place to turn it to ash. Nah. Sorry, Evie. Not doing it. Evelyn frowned at Rain, frowned at the cottage, then frowned back at Rain again. Then she frowned at Twill, then at me, then even at Jing looming at the edge of the darkness, then finally at Preem. Preem, she said. No fires, said Preem. TCH. Evelyn tooted. Great. Rain's got a bloody good point, right? Twill said. Burning up cult shit, that's one thing, but we've scoped the house, there's bugger all in there. It's just a holiday home. It's not as if anybody's gonna know we were here, but yeah, I don't wanna 'cause a wildfire. You know. The garden has to be destroyed, Evelyn said, loud and clear, glancing at me. I insist. She planted her stick firmly again, leaning forward like a general over a map table. This was a trap, for Heather. Quickly and with more than a touch of anger, Evelyn re-outlined her theory about the purpose of Edward's trap, for the benefit of Rain and Twill. They listened without interruption. Rain came to my side and put an arm around my shoulders. Twill grimaced deeper and deeper, as if listening to a story that got worse with every detail. Rain asked a couple of questions, but nothing I hadn't already asked before. The garden must be destroyed, Evelyn repeated. Rain blew out a long sigh and glanced over the upturned earth. She was holding on to me pretty tightly. Maybe if we dig a firebreak. Maybe. I dunno. I went. But you know, garden's wrecked already. Twill gestured at the ruined lawn. Job's a good un, said Preem. Evelyn gritted her teeth. I don't want to leave a single trace, not one. Evie, Rain said softly. You don't seriously believe Eddie Boy didn't keep notes on this? That this was his only attempt, a prototype with no backups? We're not talking about experimental giant robots here. He's a mage. He'll have design documents. Destroy this all you like, but it won't help. Evelyn ground her teeth again. She met my eyes, searching, questioning. We've destroyed the garden, Evie, I said. Let's not risk a fire. Then, in a smaller voice, I added, he won't get to me again. Evelyn sucked on her teeth, let her shoulders slump, and let out a big sigh. Fine. You're right. He'll have design notes. There's nothing stopping him from making another one of these. Besides, we already have enough left to get done tonight. We do. Twill puffed out a sigh. Serious? We have a kidnapped little girl in our house, Evelyn said, glancing around at the rest of us. Edward may not be aware she survived, but if he's smart, he'll be setting up a plan to call the police on us. Ah, went Rain. Smart man would do that, yeah. Twill blinked like she was trying to wake up from a dream. What? Yes, Evie, I said. What do you mean? I already said it loud and clear. We have a kidnapped little girl in our house. We need to get that girl back to her parents. Not tomorrow, not in the morning. Tonight. Now. ASAP. We need to make a plan to drop her off at a police station and... No. It took me a second to realize that I'd snapped. Evelyn blinked at me in shock, taken aback. Rain rubbed my shoulder. Hey, Heather, it's alright, we're gonna help her, yeah. Evelyn gathered herself and sighed. Heather, you rescued that girl, yes, but our responsibility is to... No, I didn't rescue her, not yet, I said. I haven't finished the rescue yet. It's not over until her family believes her. Police are launching an urgent appeal to help locate a little girl who went missing this weekend. Natalie Skeets, 10, of Prestwich, Greater Manchester, vanished only meters from the back door of her parents' house, at around 8:15 p.m. on Sunday night. Natalie is white, about 4 foot 2 inches tall, with long dark brown hair. She was last seen wearing gray jogging bottoms and a lilac pajama top, but may also be wearing a yellow plastic raincoat and a pair of purple Wellington boots. Police currently believe she followed a family pet out into the back street behind her house. Rain paused to pull a theatrically painful wince. She didn't look up from the newspaper she had spread out across the table in the magical workshop. She was leaning over it, hands braced on the edge of the tabletop. She hadn't bothered to sit down since she'd returned with the paper and cast it onto the table like evidence in a dramatic criminal trial. "Sounds like our girl," Evelyn said between clenched teeth. "Is there more?" "Oh, you bet there's more." Rain cleared her throat and put on her best serious young woman newsreader voice. "Police believe this may be a rare case of stranger kidnapping, as Natalie has no history of wandering off and no members of her extended family are being treated as suspects. The family cat is also missing, a ginger tomcat of advanced age who answers to Termy. Members of the public are asked to report any sightings of deceased or stray ginger cats." Rain winced again. They're desperate. Dead cats? Seriously? "It makes a certain kind of logical sense," Evelyn said. She sounded dead inside, maybe that was just the exhaustion. She didn't look happy either, especially when she turned and glared at me. "Listening closely, Heather." I did my best not to hiccup or flinch when Evelyn drawled venom. The pint of caffeine in my veins was making me twitchy already, and the painkillers had put me on edge. The strong stuff, from Evie's private, secret, semi-legal stash. At least Evie and Rain couldn't see that I was hugging myself with all my tentacles, desperate to keep a firm grip on my nerves. I tried to sit up straight in my chair. Tried to look like I knew what I was doing. This was going to work. I had to believe it was going to work. "Of course," I said to Evie. I didn't quite manage to keep my voice level. My smile must have been a grimace. "Evie, of course I'm listen." Preem answered before I had a chance to lose my temper, which I would have regretted dearly. "Termy is upstairs," Preem intoned. "Safe cat. With Lozzie." Evelyn gritted her teeth and made an irritated grumble. "Still," Rain said. "Police are hoping to find a dead cat. They really have got bugger all, huh?" "Well," I said, "Natalie did literally vanish. We can't blame them for being stumped." Evelyn snorted. "Can blame the police for a lot of shit." "Is that all, Rain?" Rain resumed reading from the article. "Extensive inquiries are underway, but attempts to find Natalie are as yet unsuccessful. Greater Manchester Police are urging anybody with information on Natalie or her whereabouts to contact them on 101, blah blah blah." Rain pulled an ironic grin. "Just the usual boilerplate for any missing kid. Plus there's a picture of her here." Rain half turned the newspaper so we could see, but there was no need. The grainy picture showed a gap-toothed little girl in a school uniform polo shirt, smiling a big toothy smile. It was unmistakably the same girl who was currently curled up fast asleep on Lozzie's bed. A little insert picture in the corner showed what was probably meant to be Termy, but the marmalade gentleman was barely recognizable from the grainy cat-shaped smudge. "At least this confirms she isn't some homunculus made by Edward or something," Rain said. "Right?" "Right," Evelyn agreed. She didn't sound happy about that either. "Small mercies," I said, trying not to sigh. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. We were all shattered and exhausted, full of coffee and painkillers, and we still had a kidnapped little girl in the house. And we couldn't agree what to do about her. We had returned from the cottage in rural Devon about an hour and a half earlier, carrying the remains of Edward's bizarre machine, a faint regret at not starting a huge wildfire, and the seeds of a blazing row. Practical realities had doused the heat of the potential argument. However, if we got too carried away debating the finer points of what to do next, we might not hear the police pulling up outside the house. Provisionally, I did actually agree with Evie. She was correct, we needed to resolve this quickly, both for our own safety and for little Natalie's mental and emotional health. If it was up to me, I would have let the girl sleep through the night, fed her a large breakfast in the morning, and only then set about the delicate process of returning her to her parents without getting us all arrested. Everything would be much easier after a good night's sleep, we'd be less irritable, far less tired, and far more able to think clearly. Less likely to bite each other's heads off, too. But we might not have that long. Evie was right about that, too. If Edward figured out or simply guessed, or took a gamble that Natalie was alive, then he might call the police with an anonymous tip. Just imagine the newspaper the following morning: kidnapped girl found in occult student squat. Local neo-pagans outraged. University scandalized. Several young women arrested on suspicion of a myriad of bizarre crimes. Of course it wouldn't come to that, whatever happened, but I would rather avoid having to send a dozen police officers on a one-way trip outside. So while Natalie was still blissfully asleep and unaware, Lozzie and Tenny were most certainly not. Our first move upon returning home had been to make sure they were both awake and ready. Lozzie had strict instructions. At the first sign we were getting raided by a tactical firearms unit, she was to slip to Camelot, taking Natalie, Tenny, and Termy with her. If she heard a knock on the front door, or the screech of tires in the road, or even a friendly, "Ello, ello, ello, what's all this then?" she was to go, no questions, don't wait for the rest of us. Rain had quite liked this plan. The plod won't find anything except a bunch of students into the occult. Wiccan lesbian squat. It's perfect, elegant, can't go wrong. If Ed Boy goes through with it, the plan gets turned around on him, see? Making false reports, wasting police time, suddenly he's a suspect. Evelyn had given her a death glare. It's a far bloody cry from perfect. What if they see Zheng? I asked. Rain answered without missing a beat. Woman's rugby captain, Sherrowford Uni team. Twill had rolled her eyes and snorted at that one. Rebecca Sappington is like 5'2", and blonde. Zheng ain't gonna pass muster. We'd all looked at Twill, utterly bamboozled for a moment. Even Evelyn's anger had shut off in confusion. "'Scuse me, Twill," Rain said, "but who the hell are you talking about?" Twill looked around at the three of us like we were idiots. Sappington. Sherrowford Uni women's rugby team captain. Evelyn blinked hard, as if trying to wake up from a dream. "Since when do you follow women's rugby?" "Since." "Always?" Twill said. "You three are the students at Sherrowford, don't you know this stuff?" Evelyn sighed. "Not particularly." "I wouldn't mind, I suppose," I said. Rain laughed. "Figures. Alright, not the captain then." But Lozzie's emergency hiding place, while admittedly the best possible hiding place one could ever imagine, was only a stopgap. We had to return Natalie to her parents, preferably before we were placed under any kind of suspicion, without getting ourselves in serious legal or criminal trouble, and as I insisted, over and over in a way that would make her parents understand, acknowledge, and believe what she had experienced. I surprised myself with the rapid coherence of my own plan. I wasn't quite certain where it had come from. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, the caffeine and painkillers hadn't fully kicked in as the plan had taken shape, and I wasn't exactly good at thinking these kinds of thoughts. The power output from my tri-lobe reactor could keep me up and moving for days if need be, albeit at great cost to be paid by future Heather, but no amount of raw energy could bootstrap the cognition required for detailed, sensible, careful planning. Perhaps I'd been subconsciously working over the ideas for hours already. Perhaps the plan had taken shape when I'd been sitting on that cold stone bench, watching Evelyn work, in the garden of that little cottage. But Evelyn did not approve of my plan. Oh no, not at all. I didn't blame her though. That had been a bad moment. Evelyn and I had ended up alone in the magical workshop together, with her anger reignited in a new and unstable form, like a product of controlled nuclear decay that I was trying to guide into place for a useful purpose. She was exhausted too, but unwilling to back down. Zheng was still upstairs with Lozzie. Twill had conked out on the kitchen table. Preen was content to watch us argue, but then she bustled around in the kitchen, making even more coffee. Rain had left only moments earlier, on a hurried trip to the nearest all-night corner shop, to pick up a copy of the Manchester Evening News. "No, Evie, I don't think you do." "I'm sorry, but I don't think you do." I'd said it quietly, but I'd meant it. Evelyn had looked ready to surrender to a migraine. She'd curled up so hard that I almost broke cover and went over to hug her. But then she sat up again, raging. "I could maybe understand if you were talking about something like dropping her off in her own bed, and leaving a letter for the parents. Maybe. That would still be too much risk. And it wouldn't be enough. Evie, please. It wouldn't be enough. They won't believe her. She'll grow up being told it didn't happen, that none of it was real, that it was all just a bad dream." Evelyn bit her tongue, literally. I could see her teeth chewing on the inside of her mouth as she stared at me. We were both sitting at the table in the magical workshop, on the same side. I'd chosen that very purposefully, when we'd sat down, rather than sitting across from her. I didn't need Evelyn say the magician for this, and I could make do without Evelyn the strategist, though I would always welcome her input. I had the plan all worked out. I knew what to do. What I needed was Evie, my friend, because I was terrified of failure. Preen rejoined us and refilled my coffee, which I drained as quickly as the drink cooled off. Jing drifted down from upstairs to linger on the edge of the doorway, like an animal uncertain of interrupting a pair of smaller predators, lest they turn on her and join forces. In the kitchen, Twill was snoring. "Then maybe it was a dream," Evelyn said eventually. Something cold bristled inside my chest. "Excuse me? Heather, this girl, Natalie, she is not like you." Evelyn's voice came cold and cruel. For just a second, I hated her, but I grabbed that feeling before it could wriggle down into my gut. I dissected it and ate the parts. This wasn't Evie's fault. She was trying to look after all of us. "She is like me," I said. "Evie, please." I drained the rest of my coffee to conceal the wound. I had to make Evelyn understand. I needed her approval. "Evie," I said, far softer than her. "She's one of us now." "How?" "Heather, she's 10, she barely even understands what she's been through, she's been exposed to magic. She's been outside. That will have changed her. Isn't that how it works?" Evelyn opened her mouth to snap at me again, but then stopped dead, almost panting. She drew a hand over her face and grimaced. She hated everything about this situation. "We don't know what she might see as she grows up," I went on, trying to stay calm. "What she might stumble onto, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. She needs to be prepared. Her parents need to understand. She's in the know. She's one of us. I won't treat her otherwise." Rain saved us the embarrassment of tears which we were both on the verge of bursting into, for slightly different reasons by returning at that exact moment. She announced herself by throwing the front door wide open and shouting, "Only me, not the police," which made Twill emit a sleeping snort from the kitchen. Then she'd slapped the newspaper down on the table to show us the article about Natalie's disappearance. "Small mercies," I repeated again, trying to smile. 1 o'clock in the morning, and we still couldn't agree. Finally done, Rain flapped the newspaper shut to the front page. She straightened up and rolled her neck from side to side, then flexed her shoulders and stretched her arms. She was just as tired as the rest of us, but taking pains not to show it too much. Evelyn stared at the newspaper, then directly at me, a silent accusation in her dark-rimmed eyes, waiting for my response to the fact that Natalie was already in the news. Preen waited at her shoulder. Jing brooded, tall and dark and silent, arms folded as she leaned against the wall next to the door. She was watching me too, waiting for my decision. Twill was still asleep face down on the kitchen table, head buried in her arms. I envied her. Everybody was waiting for me. I was the one with the plan, after all. Rain blew out a big sigh and gestured at the paper. They were on it quick, yeah. It's only the Manchester Evening News, but what's that, less than 24 hours between her going missing and this going to print? Good parents, said Preem. Rain pointed a finger gun at Preem, but the gesture wasn't backed with a smile. Just a blank, for once. Smart parents, yeah. They didn't wait to report her missing. On it right quick. Evelyn snorted. Newspapers wouldn't give a toss if it was a kid from some sink estate. Or 10 years older. Rain pulled a slow wince. True. Still, if it was me, I wouldn't hesitate to exploit missing white girl syndrome. Every tiny advantage means more chance of her being found, right? Evelyn frowned at Rain. So. Yes, Rain, I added. Where are you going with this? Rain gave us a wry smile. One article in the Manchester Evening News now, that's gonna be a BBC television item by the morning, tomorrow evening at latest. Most missing kids are found pretty quick, because they've just wandered off or been snatched by a family member or something. But this? This is a genuine vanishing. Girl just went like that. Rain clicked her fingers. The parents are middle class, they've got resources, they'll be playing the media as much as they can, and I can't blame them for trying. And the media is gonna love it. Evelyn nodded slowly, then stared at me. Yes, I know, it has to be tonight, I said. I understand that. Rain shrugged. Right now, if she turns up in her own family home, they can probably bullshit something to the police. I doubt they're watching the place that carefully, not yet. But if this gets any bigger before she turns back up, they might be suspected of having hidden her, for publicity or money or whatever. And that's not gonna make your plan go smooth, Heather. I'd guess we've got until the morning, that's when it'll hit national news. If you're gonna do this, you gotta do it now. Can't let Nat sleep. I know. I snapped. I know, okay. I'm ready to do it, I'm ready to go. The plan will work. Or at least I'm pretty sure it will. I have to try. Evelyn snorted with derision and disbelief, shaking her head. Rain winced and averted her eyes with theatrical display. Zheng stared at Evie, darkly unreadable. I couldn't tell if she had faith or not. This may be a step too far, even for her shaman. Preem stared not at Evelyn, but at me. I swallowed my irritation and summoned all the love I held for Evie. Evie, do you really think there's no chance of her parents adapting quickly enough? Evelyn sighed, closed her eyes, and rubbed the bridge of her nose. When she answered, it was through gritted teeth, in a tone of fake politeness dripping with sarcasm. I doubt very much that they will respond well, no. Most people don't handle the occult truth without either going mad, becoming obsessed, or spending the rest of their life denying it. What do you think will happen, HM? What do you think is likely? But Natalie herself. Yes, children are pliable. Adults are not. Basic neuroplasticity. Nothing supernatural about it. What about with the father of Amy Stack's boy? Shuja. He believed. He adapted. Because he'd already been broken down. Evelyn spat, rounding on me, losing her temper. If I understood the man's personal history correctly, then Shuja Yusufzai spent a significant portion of his life in a war zone, seeing his culture and society bombed and shot and bathed in blood. And then he had a child with an ex-mercenary and professional assassin. The man knows how to compartmentalize, how to keep his mouth shut. But you know what's most important? Evelyn didn't. Wait for an answer, eyes blazing at me. He knows a tiny bit about the fragility of consensus reality. So when he was exposed to the supernatural truth, he could just about deal with it. Just about. Evelyn huffed out a great irritated sigh. Though I bet he spends an awful lot of time trying not to think about it very much. I gathered all my courage. I already knew where this was going. So I have to break them. Evelyn made a fist and looked like she wanted to punch herself in the forehead. A random middle-class couple from suburban Manchester. What did the girl say? Her father is a teacher. Rain confirmed. A teacher, great, yes. The salt of English soil will not break cleanly, Heather. They'll shatter into a million pieces. You have no idea who her parents are. They could be fundamentalist Christians, or hardcore ideological atheists, and neither of those positions is going to take well to having their entire worldview torn apart when you shove a tentacle into their faces. There's not going to be any tentacle shoving. These are settled people. People who believe it can't happen here, who have probably lived their entire lives inside a comfortable box of thought and perception. And you're not talking about slowly breaking them down over months or years, which might work, maybe, if you were very, very lucky indeed. You're talking about breaking them in minutes. Evie, their daughter, vanished without a trace. I think they might be open to alternate explanations right about now. Evelyn hissed frustration between her teeth. And what if one of them is mentally ill, huh? What if one of them suffers from schizophrenia, for real? You introduced the real truth, you have no idea what kind of damage you could do. I have to believe that they would be willing to risk that for their child, I said. Evie, we're talking about a little girl who doesn't have her parents right now. They're not on her side. But they could be. It's worth the risk, to them and to myself. The room fell silent for a moment, but the gravity of my words was rather undercut by Twill snoring softly from the kitchen. Which was lucky, because I hadn't intended to say anything of such great import. I was merely explaining why this mattered. I hadn't put it in words before. I looked down into my lap, sinking into myself. Evelyn sighed and turned away, rubbing her forehead. Preem clicked out of the room, bustled around in the kitchen for a few moments, and returned with a freshly refilled pot of coffee. She topped up my mug. I sipped from it right away. She topped up Evie's mug too, but Evelyn left it untouched. Rain said my name softly. Hey, Heather. I looked up. Rain was smiling, soft and warm, radiating that absolutely unconditional acceptance, the bedrock of her boundless confidence. You're trying to do the right thing. I admire you for that. I really do, truly. But? Rain considered for a moment, sighed, then shook her head. There's no but. If you gotta try it, then you gotta try it. I'd be a hypocrite to tell you otherwise. Evelyn snorted through her nose, shaking her head. A great yawn echoed from the kitchen, followed by a smacking of lips and a clattering of chair legs on flagstones. Twill appeared in the magical workshop doorway a moment later, squinting bleary eyes and scratching her scalp through her thick dark hair. We still on this?" she asked. "I don't see any coppers about, so I guess we haven't been swatted yet." "What's the plan, yo?" Preem addressed her. "Go back to sleep." "Nah, I'm good. Ready to yeah. 1 2, woo." Twill sketched a couple of limp punches into the air. "Coffee," said Preem. "Nah thanks." Eventually, Evelyn sighed. "Heather, you don't have an obligation to save everybody. You can't. You said it yourself, you're not a superhero. You don't have to right every single wrong in the world, it's not your responsibility. You already rescued this girl. We can keep an eye on her from a distance if we have to." Zheng purred like a half-awake tiger, which made Twill jump and almost spill her coffee. Preem refilled it. "The shaman cannot deny her nature," Zheng said. "I have a responsibility here, Evie," I said. "TCH, Evelyn tooted. "Your responsibility is to us. All of us." And then to Evie gritted her teeth, like the words stuck in her throat, like she didn't want to use this, didn't want to stoop to this level. And to Maisie. "How does this bring you any closer to your goal? How does this get us closer to your sister?" I've already said, Natalie is one of us now. That doesn't answer my question, she snapped. You're not atoning for anything here, Heather. You were not responsible for leaving your sister behind. You were a child, you couldn't have known. Evelyn jabbed the tabletop with a finger. You were not responsible. That rendered me speechless. All my carefully constructed armor of level temper and rational planning fell away. I just gaped at Evie. Coffee. Drink, said Preem, right next to Twill's face. Rain and Zheng were both sensible enough not to interrupt. They understood. Evelyn braced, a subtle shifting of muscles and posture, as if I was about to strike her. I think Evelyn expected me to snap back at her. I think she was trying one last tactic, the one that might make me hate her, to stop me from accepting yet another dangerous task. She hadn't said those words as a cynical and hurtful blow against my ego. She truly meant it. She didn't want me to torture myself with guilt and responsibility. Instead, I clambered out of my chair, crossed the few paces between us, and gave her a hug. It was an awkward hug, like every embrace between Evelyn and I, snagged and complicated by the difficulties of avoiding too much pressure on her back and spine, but also more awkward than usual, not just because I had to bend down, but because she flinched. She expected me to be angry. At first she just sat there, half frozen, but then finally reached up and awkwardly patted me on the shoulder, clearing her throat and blushing. After a good long while I let go and straightened up again, stepping back and smiling down at Evie. She sighed up at me, exasperated, anger all burnt out. Heather, why are you like this? Like what? Like oh, never mind. Evie, I'm not trying to atone for anything. Natalie isn't like Maisie, I'm not treating her as a surrogate for my sister. She's like me. I'm saving myself, in miniature. The me I could never save. And I'm not ashamed to say so. I wish I could reach back through time, with everything I know now, and save myself. I wish I could introduce my younger self to you, to Rain, to everybody I know now. I wish you'd been there, when I was little. When I'd returned from Wonderland. I wish I'd had any of you as a friend. But I can't do that, so all I'm trying to do is make sure that little girl doesn't suffer even 1/100th of what I did. Evelyn made a grumbling sound, blushing quietly and staring at her coffee mug. Then she scooped it up and took a deep drag on the beverage. If you must, Heather. Who am I to resist, after all? You're my best friend, I said, then glanced around at everybody else. Well, one of them. Twill raised a toast with her coffee. It's cool, hey. I dragged my chair closer to Evie before sitting down again. Evie, I'll ask you once more. Do you think my plan has any chance of working? Evelyn studied me for a moment, then glanced over at Zheng, then back at me. She sucked on her teeth. Out in the road, a car passed by the house. We all froze for a long, long moment as the sound of the engine receded into the city. Everybody held their breath, but no follow-up came. The road fell silent again. Clear, Rain said. I nodded. Evelyn sighed. Twill pulled a nasty face. Your plan isn't completely impossible, Evelyn conceded, returning to the subject. But that's about the limit of my optimism. Her gaze turned hard and sharp and cold. Evelyn the strategist, you do understand that you're going to have to be violent for this to work, yes? I nodded. I did understand, all too well. Yes, I know. I'm not going to enjoy it or anything, but I know. You're going to have to terrify those people out of their minds, and I mean that literally. You can't risk half measures with this. You need to aim for that clean break, even if I don't think it's achievable. You need to prove me wrong. Camelot won't be enough. I know. Evelyn froze for a second. Her eyes widened by a fraction, caught on sudden fear. You're not going to take them to Wonderland? Gods, Evie, no. I actually laughed, the idea was so absurd. I needed that release of tension. Evelyn huffed and went red in the face. Rain blew out a theatrical sigh of relief, as if she would possibly have believed that too. Twill pulled an uncomfortable face and tried to share a glance with Preem, but the doll demon was staring at the coffee in her hands again. Absolutely not, I repeated. If I ever start planning that, feel free to tie me up. Evelyn shot me an odd frown. Rain snorted. Right. Well. I'll remember that. At least you seem to understand. Though I'm not sure I agree with your choice of squad for this, either. Zheng rumbled from the other side of the room, a danger sound from the depths of the rainforest. Who? Not you, you bloody great oaf. Evelyn huffed. You're the one I actually approve of. Stop taking offense at everything. Twill guffawed. Yeah, you heard the lady. Grow some thicker skin. Zheng blinked slowly, apparently not offended. Might squad. I echoed, cringing. Evie, you're all my squad. We're all each other's squad. Goodness, that's a very imprecise word. Are you certain Tenny is up to this? Evelyn asked. Oh. I nodded, putting Evelyn's questionable choice of words out of my mind for now. Tenny is a lot more mature than she seems. And I think she understands this, she understands what's going on. Lozzie will be there too, and, well, not to put too fine a point on it, Lozzie needs the support as well. Tenny's presence will keep her grounded. Rain cleared her throat. Tens does also happen to be the most obviously supernatural-looking person we've got. I sighed. That too. If we have to rely on that. Plus, Rain added, bright and confident. I thanked her silently for that. Nat was literally cuddled up with her. If we're gonna have any chance of convincing the parents, that's a pretty good shot. I'd take it. Heather will be taking the shot, Evelyn said, staring right at me. Alone. I gave Evelyn the most irritated look I could muster, which probably just made me seem constipated and on the verge of crying. But it must have worked, because she blinked. Evie, please, I said, then hiccuped, finally losing control. I'm already struggling to stay calm, thinking about doing this. Please don't make it worse. My hands were knotted tight in my lap. I had to make a conscious effort to relax my fingers, raise one hand, and straighten it out. I was shaking, quite badly. Evelyn sighed, shook her head, then reached out and took my hand, squeezing gently. Rain crossed around the table and joined us too. Her hands found my shoulders and started kneading my muscles. Evie said, you really shouldn't be drinking enough coffee to fell an elephant. I laughed, weakly. It's not the coffee. And I'm not going to be alone. Rain agreed with sudden gusto. Damn right. Zheng purred like a sleeping tiger. The shaman will be protected. She knew how important she was to this. I couldn't pull it off truly by myself. Evelyn narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips. She started to say something, then stopped and looked away. Yes, but neither I or Rain you're not. The fewer of us involved, the safer it will be, I said, trying to sound confident. Evelyn clenched her teeth, but she nodded in grudging acceptance. None of you can take your mobile phones along, understand? Nothing identifying. So don't screw up, don't get separated, and for God's sake make sure Lozzie knows her part. She'll do as I ask, I said. I trust Lozzie. She understands the stakes. Yeah, Rain agreed. We all saw how she reacted to Nat. Evie seemed doubtful, but she didn't voice it. You don't even show yourselves until it's worked. I mean it. Total anonymity. I nodded. I've planned for that. And what about the logistics, she demanded. Her frown was different now, thoughtful and probing. She might not approve, but she was involved now. My strategist was on board, asking questions that mattered. How are you going to make such a pinpoint slip? Lozzie can do the recon stage, I said, then sighed and almost rolled my eyes. Recon stage, listen to me, I sound like Rain. Rain cleared her throat, mock bashful. Well, that was what I called it. It's the right technical term. I carried on. We already have the address, we've. Evelyn snorted. Assuming the girl remembered her address correctly. She's only 10. Rain laughed at that for some reason. Evelyn frowned up at her. What? What is it? Evie, think about yourself at 10. Rain shook her head. And hey, the house is gonna be pretty obvious, it'll be the one with a copper or two standing outside. Quite, Evelyn said through her teeth. I tried again. We have the address. And we've located the house on Google Maps. I've already proved I can slingshot from that information alone. Yes, outdoors, on a clear hilltop that was visible in the satellite picture. You're talking about inside a house. Hence Lozzie. She's pretty confident that she can set up the rest. All I need is a picture of the inside, I think I can make it work from there. Evelyn sighed heavily. You've really thought this through, haven't you? You've covered everything. I shrugged. I barely needed to think. It was already there. Zheng spoke up again. The shaman knows more than she thinks she knows, always. Pfft, went Twill. What the hell is that supposed to mean? There's no need to mystify it, Zheng, I said. It's just old trauma. How many hours do you think I've spent fantasizing about how different my life would have been, if only my parents had understood and believed? Zheng stared back at me for several heartbeats, then dipped her head in acknowledgement. Well, said Evelyn, finally letting go of my hand and placing it back in my lap. The sooner, the better. What do you need, Heather? I shook my head. Not much. Sevens is ready for her role, she'll be in place before everything else. Lozzie can start as soon as I take over on emergency slip duty, just in case the police do turn up after all. Termy, said Preem. Yes. I nodded. I won't forget Termy. That's another reason we need Tenny, somebody will have to carry him. Somebody not Natalie. And don't forget you made a deal with the Shambler, Evelyn said, watching me closely, as if she suspected I might go back on that unspoken agreement. She can wait until after this is done, but not much longer. You made that creature a promise, sort of. That was my cue to smile. I thought it was bright and happy, but it must have looked as sharp and devious as Evie herself, because she blinked at me in surprise. 2 birds with 1 stone, I said. Or at least 1.5. Isabella and Stephen Skeets, Natalie's mother and father, were not sleeping soundly in their bed that night, not even by 2 o'clock in the morning, the dead hour when we put my plan into action. One could hardly blame them for insomnia. Their daughter, their little girl, their only child, Natalie, was missing, presumed kidnapped. They probably blamed themselves for the momentary lapse of attention during which she had chased Termy out the back door. They blamed themselves for not watching her carefully enough, for not impressing upon her the danger of the world beyond her home, for not arming her against the threat of unknown strangers in dark alleyways. They were wrong, of course. But their guilt and horror played into our hands. If they'd been sleeping in their bedroom on the 2nd floor of their modest detached house in suburban Manchester, with its red brick exterior, its tiny garden, and its solid walls, we would have been unable to pinpoint their location, unable to ensure the element of surprise. But they were downstairs, in their poky little sitting room with its floral curtains and brown carpet, bathed in the electric blue glow of a muted television. They were also alone. Rain's warnings turned out to be an exaggeration. There was no police constable standing outside their front door, only a single patrol car waiting several houses away, containing a single officer, who was mercifully fast asleep. By tomorrow night, with the toxic hydra of national news bearing down on them, that might change quite quickly. In the morning undoubtedly they would be joined by visiting family, to offer help and support. But not yet. For now, our window was clear. Zheng and I landed almost exactly on target right in the middle of the Skeet's sitting room. Accuracy surprised me. I was getting better at this. Despite my assurances to Evelyn, all I had to calibrate the slingshot slip was a blurry phone camera photo taken by Lozzie, about 3 minutes earlier, through a crack in the sitting room curtains. She'd slipped into the Skeet's back garden before us, crept up to the police car to confirm she wasn't about to be caught, and then crept around the exterior of the house to see what she could see. In another life, Lozzie could have been a super spy. She could get in and out of anywhere, unseen, untraced. I'd never really thought about that before. We'd gotten lucky with the crack in the curtains, that meant we didn't have to break into the place. Less evidence, less noise, less chance of something going wrong and more impact for our arrival. Once it was all over and done with, I spent a lot of time thinking about what Natalie's parents must have seen in that moment. Two shadowy figures stepped out of thin air right before their eyes, as if disgorged by a hidden fold in reality that they'd been unable to see their entire lives. Backlit by the mute, dead light of their television set, a sudden intrusion into what remained of their domestic security. The last tatters of the veil ripped away in an instant. One figure was a towering giant on the very border of the humanly possible, 7 feet of rippling meat, predatory animal intent, drooling and hissing through a maw of razor-sharp teeth. The other figure was somehow no less inhuman, but subtly so, head and face hidden inside a mask of bone that couldn't possibly be real, the curves a haunting hint of otherworldly meaning. What they didn't see was the difficulty that went into not falling over. Zhang and I had to control the situation instantly, which was a very polite way of saying we needed to stay coherent enough to do sudden and terrible violence. That was part of why I'd selected Jing alone for this. I had plenty of experience slipping, keeping myself conscious and coherent well, mostly, and I was confident that by redlining my reactor I could keep myself on my feet for the crucial few seconds, though I would pay for it later on, perhaps steeply. Zheng had once fallen from a building and shrugged off broken legs, shortly after fighting the building from the inside. She knew what was at stake here. She could find the reserves for this. We had made a plan before we'd left home. Zheng would go for the father, Stephen. I would go for the mother, Isabella. There would be no need to communicate upon arrival. The plan was simple. It almost worked. The split second we arrived nauseated, swallowing a tidal wave of vomit, my reactor going full blast inside my belly, trying to orient myself in an unfamiliar space while a deep lance of pain rammed itself through my eye sockets and into my brain. In the half-shadowed, flickering cave of this cramped sitting room I had the briefest impression of Natalie's parents. Stephen, her father, was sitting in an armchair to the right. He had been on the verge of dozing off in the moment we had appeared, caught on the edge of fitful nightmares, his eyelids not quite open. Short and stocky, fit and neat and well-groomed, built like a football player who had aged out of the sport, with close-cropped dark hair on his head and a day's worth of dark stubble on his chin. One did not have to look very closely to see the sudden and terrible strain in a face that had been quite used to laughter, or the fact he hadn't changed his shirt and trousers in 2 days, or that he was barely there inside his own head. His eyes snapped wide, his head snapped up, bewildered and drawing breath to scream. Zheng was on him instantly, of course, even though her muscles were jellied and her senses were slowed by the aftermath of the slip. She crossed the room in one bound, ripped him out of his chair, and slammed him against the wall hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. He wheezed with the impact before Zheng clamped a hand over his mouth. She shoved her face close to his, showing all her teeth and the whites of her eyes, a universal symbol for shut up and don't make a sound. Zheng growled, low and loud. Stephen whimpered, staring right back into the depths of Zheng's eyes, crying in terror. He kicked weakly, but then gave up before he even connected with Zheng. Isabella, Natalie's mother, did not react so quickly. And neither did I. It wasn't the aftermath of the slip that held me back, or the way my head was pounding, or the roiling rebellion in my gut. I had 3 tentacles braced against the floor, 3 more coiled and ready to whip out at the woman, to hold her still and smother any screaming. I had rehearsed this step by step, I knew exactly what to do, and I'd put myself into the pose before making the slip. But I couldn't follow through. Isabella was sitting on a little brown sofa, quite distant from her husband. She wasn't dozing off. She was sitting quite upright, alert and aware, staring directly at me. A tall and willowy woman in a green cardigan, a shawl, and a long skirt, with very long, very dark hair, just like her daughter. She had been crying, an awful lot, her eyes ringed by raw, red skin. Many tissues were balled up on the sofa cushion next to her, with no attempt made to clear them away. Perhaps in normal times she was beautiful, in an ethereal sort of way, elfin and impish, with playful crow's feet in the corners of her eyes. But right then she was haunted and harrowed, and horribly aware. I knew that look. That emptiness which comes when a missing piece of oneself has been ripped away by the unknown, that racking guilt of failure and loss and not even knowing what had truly happened. No oblivion of nightmares for Isabella, no soporific tears to carry her off into a fantasy where she hadn't lost her daughter. She was wide awake and wide-eyed and dying inside. She looked like me, before I'd had any hope. She looked like me in the mirror. And for a split second, I couldn't do it. This woman didn't deserve to be pinned to the wall by some horrifying abyssal monster that had invaded her home. She didn't deserve to get shouted at and browbeaten and broken. She didn't deserve violence and horror, no matter how much it might help her daughter in the long run. I saw myself sitting there, grieving for Maisie, and I was about to do to her the opposite of everything I had needed when I'd been in her place, everything I had needed and gotten and cherished. The plan crumbled to nothing. Behind my squid skull mask, I opened my mouth to offer salvation, to give the game away before it had even started. Natalie's alive, it's okay, we're here to return her. I've saved your daughter. It's okay, don't be afraid. The words were on my lips and they would ruin everything. Evie's clean break would be rendered truly impossible. They would never believe their daughter without exposure to the truth. Then, Isabella went for her mobile phone. The phone was sitting on an end table next to the sofa, just beyond her reach, so she twisted and dived for it, as if she could somehow dial 999 and shout about monsters invading her home before I got to her. That was an act of true courage, because it was both pointless and mattered more than she could possibly understand. If she thought we were connected with her daughter's kidnapping, then to die for her phone was an act of rebellion against loss. And it worked. With that futile, clumsy leap for the phone, she killed the words in my throat and saved her daughter's future. I used 3 tentacles like a spring, launched myself across the space that divided us, hissing like a rattlesnake, and slammed into the poor woman with my other 3 tentacles. Several seconds of messy, awkward struggle ensued, neither photogenic nor dramatic, just banal and violent. Isabella was not a physically strong woman, but she was driven by a burning need. My tentacles were stronger than my human arms would ever be, but I was off balance, confused, blindsided by my own momentary inaction and the woman's courage. Isabella's strength only gave out when she realized she was struggling against invisible forces. In a few seconds I had her pinned against the sofa by wrists and throat, with 1 tentacle over her mouth. Panting, shaking, covered in cold sweat, I straightened up in front of Isabella's skeets and stared down into a pair of eyes full of terror and hate. What did she see when she looked at me? A monster wearing the skull of a squid, something impossible and profane. I'm sorry, I croaked. Shaman. Zheng purred over her shoulder. Got her, I panted back. I got her. Zheng grunted. Ready? Yes. Bring him over here. Zheng hauled Natalie's father round by his throat and the front of his shirt, then slammed him down on the sofa next to his wife. Stay, she rumbled between razor-sharp teeth, but she kept her grip on him tight, one hand clamped over his mouth, just in case. Isabella stared at Zheng too, intimidated by the sheer size of her, the thrumming animal presence, the threat of rapid violence. Zheng also wasn't wearing a mask, but she managed to look even more inhuman than I, a grinning demon in the flickering light from the television set. Behind my squid skull mask, I swallowed hard and cleared my throat. I could not afford to hiccup during this. That would ruin everything. It would make me seem more human in their eyes. "Look at me," I said, loud and clear. The skeets hesitated for a moment, their attention stuck on Zheng, on her threatening promise. A small miscalculation. "Ignore her," I snapped. "Look at me. Look at me." The snap in my voice worked. I was imitating rain, after all. Stephen and Isabella both flinched, though with slightly different timings. Stephen was slower, confused, terrified. Isabella was slightly more present. They both stared in terror at my mask, at the twisted voice coming from inside. I made no effort to straighten out my throat after the hiss earlier. On the contrary, I allowed it to worsen, to pull tighter, turning my voice into a scratching, croaking nightmare. The squid skull mask helped too, warping my voice in a way it never had before, as if some hidden quality inside the metallic bone had risen to the occasion, responding to the need to intimidate and terrify. "We just materialized in the middle of your sitting room," I said. I reached out with another tentacle and wrapped it around Zheng's arm, then another, around Stephen's head. His eyes went wide, rolling in a futile effort to see what was touching him, panting through his nose with panic. "I am holding you bound with invisible power. You can feel it, but you can't see it. This is real." They both stared at me, eyes bloodshot with terror and grief. I didn't expect this part to get through to them, but we had to use everything, step by step. No mercy, sadly enough. I could always apologize later. "What you are experiencing is real," I carried on, trying desperately to keep the steel in my voice. Inside I was shaking. I pictured myself as Evelyn, as Rain, as all the qualities in both of them which I admired so much. Courage, steadfast, unwavering. I had to be unwavering now. I had to inflict pain. But I was no torturer, and I was torturing these two. We hadn't even started yet. I went for the low blow, the setup, just to get it over with. You have to concentrate on what you are experiencing. If you want to save your daughter, Natalie, then you have to concentrate. Stephen blinked rapidly, sweat and tears in his eyes, but he was paying attention now. Oh yes, he was here now, he was on board. Isabella stared right at me, her gaze going through my mask and meeting the flesh inside. She knew I was in charge here. She knew what I was offering, if only on an instinctive level, and she would do anything, listen to anything, believe anything. I didn't like that feeling, the feeling of being in absolute command, of holding their lives in my hand. But I could use it for good, here and now. "I am a monster from a place beyond your worst nightmares," I said. Technically true, sort of. Adopted daughter of the eye and all that. And I do understand that your nightmares must be pretty bad at the moment. Stephen whined. Isabella tried to nod. "I am trying to return your daughter to you. I am trying to save her. But for her sake, there is something you must do. You must see where she went, for yourselves, with your own senses. Do you understand?" I didn't give them time to answer. They couldn't possibly understand, not until they saw. I wasn't giving them a choice. I began the equation, whether they wanted it or not. "I suggest you close your eyes," I said. "Or you might break faster than you can bear. Now, hold on tight." On a low island of jagged gray rock, amid an endless swamp of soupy, sucking, stinking gray mud, ringed by tall gray trees with swirls of gray branches reaching up toward a leaden gray sky, I broke the minds of two innocent human beings. I wasn't going to enjoy this. I didn't relish the banal mechanics of what I was about to inflict. Initiation into the eldritch truth was a kind of torture. I knew that better than anybody. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But from the moment the four of us arrived outside, on that outcrop of dry rock in the middle of a vast, otherworldly, inhuman wilderness, something deep down inside me began to purr with bitter satisfaction. Something made nasty and vindictive by a very different kind of long torture, warped by old scar tissue and kept suspended in pain by unhealed wounds. It had been kept in peaceful sleep for a long time recently, soothed by the love and care of friends and more, compensated by the shining abyssal truth of bodily euphoria, comforted by a place to call home that was neither hospital nor filled with hidden minefields and tripwires. But in sleep it had grown in both size and sharpness, and Natalie's plight had stirred it from dreamless slumber. I had not expected it. I had denied it for so long, I'd never thought myself capable. So when we arrived outside, and I kept my feet while Stephen and Isabella Skeets went sprawling on the rock, skinning their hands and knees, heaving for breath, eyes rolling, limbs malfunctioning in the post-slip after effects, unable to process where they were or how they had gotten here, that long-buried part of me purred a darkly satisfied laugh. Believe me now. Need to see more? No. Too bad, because there's an infinity more to see, but you are sadly finite. Those thoughts didn't reach my face, let alone creep into my words. I was horrified at myself. The sudden impulse to gloat, to mock their pain and confusion, was one of the ugliest and most nonsensical urges I'd ever felt. And it wasn't abyssal instinct trying to lord it over these clumsy apes. Abyssal instinct didn't care about this at all. I had no idea where this feeling had bubbled up from, hot and acid in my throat. To mock Edward Lilburn or another mage, somebody in the know, somebody who had chosen to do evil, that was one thing, even if it was inelegant and self-serving. But to mock these lost wretches as their souls and minds struggled with initial exposure to outside? What was wrong with me? I crammed that impulse into a bottle, rammed a cork into the neck, and sealed it away for later. If I was going to make Natalie's parents useful to her, then I could not afford the luxury of satisfying displaced personal grudges. I could not afford to project my own parents onto these two. Focus, I told myself. You must stick to the script. At least my aim was good. I managed to land us on the same outcrop of low rock that Natalie and Termy had used to hide themselves, where the shambler had laid out the corpse of the poor young man, in what I assumed was her territory. Much better than dumping all four of us into the waist-high muddy water. I didn't want to risk the parents falling over in the muck, swallowing mouthfuls of outsider swamp mud, and contracting some bizarre infection or exotic disease. I didn't want them sick or worse, dead. I wanted them to believe, to adapt, to accept. Stephen and Isabella did not react well upon arrival outside, amid the grey mud and grey vegetation and grey skies of the shambler's home dimension. But who would blame them, except somebody without empathy? When the slip spat us back out, I managed to brace myself, lock my knees, and cling to Zheng, to stop myself from falling over or vomiting, which would risk ruining the fragile dignity and intimidating act that was such an important part of this whole performance. Zheng grunted and groaned like a gut-punched mountain with the impact of the slip, but other than a brief sagging in her muscles and an audible roiling of her stomach, she managed to stay upright and together. My rock in the storm. Natalie's parents both went sprawling, gasping for air, struggling to even stay on their hands and knees rather than collapse face-first onto the filthy ground. They both vomited, unfortunately enough, all stringy bile from stomachs kept empty by stress, though Stephen seemed to resist the urge for a few seconds longer than his wife. Shaking and quivering, covered in cold flash sweat, racked with the inexplicable pain of the slip, they both tried to gather themselves and get to their feet, or at least to their knees. Neither of them got very far. Zheng and I stayed silent at first, watching and waiting to see what might happen. That was also part of the plan. When Evelyn had voiced her many doubts about the safety and practicality of this entire process, she'd made a good point. We didn't know these people. We didn't know how they might react, or what kind of psychological mechanisms they might employ to justify or excuse what they were seeing. There was no reason for us to talk over the evidence of their own senses. I allowed outside to do the talking for us. Stephen, Natalie's father, exerted raw stubborn muscle power and managed to struggle halfway to his feet, scuffing the knees of his trousers on the rough surface of the rock. But halfway there he must have located his wits, because he froze, staring out at the endless mud flats beyond the thinning trees to our left. He stayed like that for several long seconds, unblinking and gaping, as if trapped in a vision. Then he turned, slowly, taking in the things that weren't quite trees, the leaden sky like a ceiling of grey weight, and the vast towering vegetation far away to the right, where the trees grew taller than earthly redwoods. His eyes fixed on the faint hint past even the trees themselves, the vague outline of a tower made from grey blocks. The thing must have been taller than a skyscraper. I could just about make out a dark opening near the tip of the structure. As if struck in the middle of his chest, Stephen sat down heavily on his backside, mouth agape, staring, lost. One hand groped for his wife's side, seeking support. I wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Should I have isolated them from each other? Isabella got marginally further than her husband. She spat the taste of vomit from her mouth, wiped her face on the back of her sleeve, and hauled herself to her feet as if pulled on a set of puppeteer's strings. Only when she gained her feet did she peer about at the impossible swamp, the grey mud, and the imitations of trees, draped with their swirls of vegetation that seemed to suck one's attention inward. Shivering, hunching, wringing her hands together so hard that it must have hurt her finger bones, Natalie's mother visibly struggled against onrushing hyperventilation. Stephen tried to speak, but it came out as little more than half-formed unthoughts, animal reaction to confusion. Where wah. Isabella placed one hand on her husband's shoulder, she squeezed, hard enough to hurt him. He winced and stopped trying to talk. I don't know, Isabella said. Her voice had gone high and reedy, on the edge of a personal abyss. The contact seemed to help them both, grounded them in each other. Isabella swallowed so hard I thought she was going to do herself an injury in her own throat, baring her teeth and shaking with the muscular difficulty of the motion. Stephen groped for her arm again, found it, and she helped him to his feet. Neither of them moved for a long moment, just staring out at the swamp, clinging together, listening to the distant sounds floating through the trees. The strange hooting I'd heard before, the language of the dimensional shamblers, I assumed was audible from far away, a back-and-forth chorus of calls and responses, soaked up by the trees and the mud, muffled by miles of swamp. They were more active than when I'd first visited, as if they were having some kind of debate out there among the muddy wallows and brackish flows. That was a very good sign. If I was right, then Sevens was already out there, wearing my face, buying goodwill with meat and bone. Stephen and Isabella didn't appreciate the music of the swamp, however. They flinched at the loudest of the hooting, clutching each other in terror. A pair of hairless apes, stranded beyond their wildest nightmares. That bitter part of me whispered a question: what would happen to them if I just left them here? That would be quite a lesson, wouldn't it? That part of me, the part of myself I was trying desperately not to acknowledge, the tinny voice whispering from inside the corked bottle, it judged Stephen and Isabella. It judged these stupid monkeys and found them wanting. It judged them as pathetic. My conscious mind had to admit that bitter Heather had a point there, even if it was too harsh and unyielding. The Shambler's swamp was hardly the worst place outside had to offer. It had nothing on some of the inhuman nightmare realms that I could have exposed them to, let alone the kinds of places that Lozzie would happily spend time for fun. In the end it was just a grey, weird swamp, filled with ambush predators, dangerous, perhaps, not a nice place to spend a sunny afternoon or attempt to read a book, but hardly a vista to threaten one's sanity. Part of me wanted to say something like, yes, you teleported here, get over it. But intellectually I knew that was not the whole truth. It wasn't the grey mud or the alien horizon plaguing their minds, or the effluvial stench of sulfur and brine that was getting to them. It wasn't the weird trees or the distant redwood-sized versions far away, or the massive impossible tower at the limit of vision, or the hooting in the swamp, or even the fact they'd arrived here via an inexplicable teleport. It was none of those things, and it wasn't the sum of those parts either. Right then, as they gaped out at the gray swamp, Natalie's parents were feeling the true effect of standing outside, the soul-racking sense of wrongness, of displacement, of every cell in one's body screaming you are not supposed to be here. Human beings were not bred for this, not evolved to deal with that sensation. I'd spent so much time outside, between my nightmares and the slips and the journey through Carcosa, that it was all too easy for me to forget what that felt like. To even stand here was a kind of torture, for those who did not belong. On a level I did not wish to fully acknowledge, I was meant to be out there. They were not. They were feeling that now. Zheng had never been here either, but she didn't care. Despite her magnificent clothing of skin and muscle, she was a thing of the abyss burrowed down deep inside that flesh. Different rules applied to her. She stood tall beside me, wrapped in her trench coat like an extra from a noir movie, waiting for the next move. Through the eye sockets of my squid skull mask, I scanned the nearby trees for any sign of the shambler or shambler. But she didn't seem to be watching or lurking, unless she was hiding too well for me to discover. I didn't know if that meant Seven's part of the plan had succeeded, or failed. I wouldn't know until I called out to her, but it was still too early to play that card. Finally, Stephen found his voice. "This can't be," he started, then trailed off, shaking his head. A stocky, well-built man, he was starting to bristle, muscles flexing beneath his clothes, choosing fight instead of flight. His sweat-stained, rumpled shirt was sticking to his back with sudden sweat. "It can't. Then where are we, dear?" Isabella said in a tiny voice, still clinging to her husband's hand. "Can't be real," Stephen managed to say. "It's real," I said. My squid skull mask warped and amplified my voice into an almost inhuman warble. The mask was playing along, giving me the extra edge of intimidation I might need, that last little piece of implied inhumanity. But I needed them to hear and believe, not scream in terror. Not yet, anyway. So I cleared my throat and dragged my voice back upward into a human register. "It's real," I repeated, somewhat more normal. To his great credit, Stephen found an ounce of courage. He turned toward Zheng and me, shaking his hands free from his wife's grip so he could ball up his fists. He half raised them like a boxer getting ready for a fight, ready to lash out in fear and confusion. Grief and horror were boiling away to leave behind powdered rage. His eyes bulged in his face, fists getting ready to swing, and then he sputtered out as he saw me. Isabella turned as well. They came face to face with the daughter of an alien god. Well, an adopted one. I was doing my best to look as intimidating as I possibly could, short of actually going full Homo abyssus, sprouting toxic spines and armor plating all over my body. If I'd done that, we would have been on a strict and short time limit, before I burnt out. I was holding all 6 of my tentacles fanned out wide, a sunburst of slow-strobing rainbow bioluminescence, a marine star in this realm of gray mud. Standing tall, well, as tall as I could at 5 foot nothing, with my squid skull helmet hiding my sweating, worried face, my arms folded over my chest, and my tentacles spread, I must have looked like quite the weird little mutant monster. Stephen was not about to rush me, not when he saw that. But Jing growled low in her throat regardless, a warning not to approach the outsider goddess. "Know your place, monkey," she rumbled at Stephen. He flinched, badly, barely resisting the urge to fling himself away from this towering threat. But he kept his fists raised, which was sort of impressive. Courage or madness, which was it? I had no idea, not yet. "Zheng," I said softly. "There's no need for that. All an act." We'd agreed on that, too. Though I suspected Zheng's offense was quite real. She didn't like even the suggestion of violence directed toward me. "We're very sorry," Isabella said, dipping her head, voice robotic and tight. "We're very sorry, very. I apologize for my husband." "What's to apologize?" Stephen tried to say, but he was staring at Zheng, finally taking in the 7 feet of demon host muscle that had pinned him to his own sitting room wall only minutes earlier. I could almost see the awe struggling against the need to ask the relevant questions. Then he saw the corpse, lying a few feet away on the rocks. His eyes went even wider, his teeth bared in horror. "Yes, that is a dead man," I said, as gently as I could. "He's no concern of yours. I'm going to give him a proper burial shortly." Isabella saw the corpse too, but looked away from it quickly. Her eyes stared at Jing for a second, but then settled on me, on the dark, unknowable eye holes of my squid skull mask, and whatever lay behind them. She knew I was in charge. She was also a lot more coherent than her husband. Her eyes were wide with desperation, her shoulders were hunched as if beneath the eye of some great beast, and her skin had gone gray with stress and fear, but as she stared at me she seemed to pull herself together inside, draw upright just a couple of inches, and focus her mind. She blinked hard, staring at me through the pressure of madness. That was a very bad sign. "Oh no," I whispered to myself inside my mask. I knew what was keeping her together: love for her daughter, the desperate need to get her back. That's how she was clinging to sanity, to normality, how she was avoiding truly looking at her surroundings. If only she could endure this nightmare, her daughter lay at the end of it. She was telling herself that, using it like cement or like armor, hiding inside love to avoid the truth. But I had to break her. I didn't want to have to drag these two further out, to worse places. I had to break them here, to avoid worse torture. "Why avoid it?" whispered that bitter voice, bottled up but not yet back asleep. "They will never believe, not without pain. Would you, if you had not endured it? She's not even looking. None of them ever will." Isabella opened her mouth. "Where's my daughter?" she asked. "Where's Natalie?" Her voice was high and light, a singer's voice, used to laughter and bedtime fairy tales and soft words in well-lit rooms. She stared at me with such burning intensity, such need, such desperation. If this situation devolved into violence, she would be the one to watch out for, not Natalie's father. She would do anything to get her child back. I knew the look all too well. "Stick to the plan," I told myself. "Stick to the plan, keep going. In order to save your daughter," I said, "first you must absorb where we are standing. Stop looking away. Both of you. How can this be real?" Stephen demanded, pleaded, voice shaking. That's it, he was going quickly now. Maybe he'd drag his wife with him. Eyes watering, lower lip quivering, shoulders hunched and shaking. How did we even get here? This is some kind of trick. "Dear, please," Isabella said, on the edge of a very different kind of panic. "The lady, she's trying to help. To help. Please." Stephen pointed a stubby finger at me. "You're doing something to us. Drugged us, or a projection, or." "Then step into the swamp waters," I said. "Wade as far as you like. I can protect you from the local wildlife, I think, if you need that proof." Inside the privacy of my squid skull mask, I silently prayed that he wasn't going to take me up on that offer, because wading through the swamp could quickly devolve into a farce. He might fall over. Or something might take an interest in us. Instead, Stephen tore his eyes away from me and stared out at the swamp again, then down at the corpse. He poked the dead man with one toe, felt the yielding of soft, rotting flesh, and cringed as if sick inside. Then he cast about the surface of the rocky outcrop, as if looking for something. For a moment I didn't understand what he was doing, but then he picked up a few loose pieces of stone, weighing them in his hands, before nodding in satisfaction. "Dear," Isabella said, "now is not the time for." "It is," he hissed, staring at the stones in his hands. "It is. You can't make this up. Can't make it up. Can't fool me with this. Cheap crap, can't fake it. Nonsense. Nonsense." Stephen selected a stone and threw it into the swamp. It landed out in the mud with a wet plop. He threw a second little stone, further this time, to splash down in a patch of thinner water. Then he took the third stone, relatively flat and smooth, and flicked out his hand in a practiced motion. The flat stone hit the surface of the swamp and skipped back up into the air, spinning as it went, once, twice, 3-4 times total, before it hit a tree with a loud thwack sound and fell into the swamp at last, to be swallowed by the mud. Stephen stood there, breathing hard, staring at the path of his skipping stone. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. Isabella sobbed once, into her hand. "Where are we?" Stephen said eventually. "Where is this?" Something was wrong with his voice. Struggling, tight, starting to collapse. He sounded more like a little boy than a grown man. "We are currently in a parallel dimension," I said. "It's one of many. Collectively we call them outside, because they are outside our own reality. Not very creative, I know, but that's what we call them. I haven't given this particular place a name, not yet. I brought you here with magic." Stephen, to my great surprise, hiccuped. Almost exactly like I tended to in moments of great stress. He hiccuped, then made a sort of gasping, laughing noise, like he was struggling not to giggle. It was not a reassuring sound. "Who gets to name it?" he asked. Isabella turned away, as if resigning herself to doing this alone, without her husband's madness. "Where's my daughter?" she repeated to me. "Please, how is this going to save her?" "Your daughter was kidnapped by an evil wizard," I said, then I sighed. The sound must have carried through my squid skull mask as some barely human hiss, because Isabella flinched, one hand flying to her throat as if to protect herself from a monster. I felt a strong urge to reach up inside my mask and rub the bridge of my nose. "Yes," I said, struggling not to sound utterly exasperated. "Yes, I know how that sounds, which is why I am trying to show you some proof. She was kidnapped by an evil wizard." "But," Stephen said, still staring out at the swamp. "But Nat's just a we're just." I froze, then went off script. That sounded important to dig. "You're just what?" I asked. "Nobody's." "Nobody," he said, half mumbled. "Falling fast." "Good. Keep pushing." "Natalie is just a normal little girl, yes," I said. "She was taken purely by chance, just bad luck, in the wrong place at the wrong time. She's not a chosen one. This isn't a young adult novel. She doesn't have special powers or a unique fate or destiny to fulfill. An evil wizard kidnapped her to feed her to a monster. That's all." Stephen finally turned away from the swamp and looked at the metallic visage of my squid skull mask. He was all the way out. All the color had drained from his face. Waxen, pale, as gray as the swamp around us. Covered in cold sweat, eyes wide, pupils dilated, lips quivering with the frozen effort of trying to form words but finding none adequate to the task. The armpits of his shirt were soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking as if in the grip of some palsy. He looked like he was on the verge of a heart attack. "Evil wizard," he echoed with a hysterical laugh in his voice. When he grinned, it was one of the worst expressions I'd ever seen on a human face, lips pulled back by pure mechanical action, spittle and drool leaking from between his teeth, a man pleading from behind a clown's mask, tears carving tracks into his cheeks. Evil wizard. My daughter was kidnapped by an evil wizard. What am I supposed to do with that information? Zheng took a half-step forward, to shield me. Stephen Skeets looked about ready to fight God. "Steve," Isabella said, without even looking at her husband, "sit down. You're losing your temper." He was doing a darn sight more than losing his temper. And Isabella was too calm, way too calm, as if petrifying inside. Their reactions could not have been more divergent. "What good?" Stephen managed to say. "What possible good? What? No, 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 no." He started shaking his head back and forth, gritting his teeth, squinting his eyes shut. A final line of resistance, thrown up in haste, trying to deny the truth. Isabella wasn't breaking anywhere near as fast as her husband. Or maybe she was already broken. She was still staring at me. "And what are you?" she asked, her voice full of rapture and awe. "Was that good? Or bad?" I stuck to the script, played the next card. "I'm the adopted daughter of an alien god," I said. "I happened to be passing by, that was all." Stephen bunched his fists and pressed them against his own forehead, as if suffering a terrible migraine. No, this can't. He hit himself in the head, once, then twice, hard enough to hurt, grunting and panting. "This isn't real. All of this, it's a nightmare, it's a nightmare. It's not real." Jing rumbled under her breath, speaking out of the corner of her mouth, so only I could hear. "Shaman. It's working," I whispered back. "This monkey will shake his own brain apart. Say warned us of this." I almost broke character in front of Natalie's parents in order to stare up at Zheng in surprise. I couldn't recall her using Evelyn's name ever before. To Zheng, Evie was always just wizard or mage. But there was no time to consider the implications of Zheng's sudden softening of the heart. Isabella was already speaking again, with quivering desperation in her voice. One hand reached out toward me, imploring, fingers shaking. Zheng raised a hand to ward her off before she could grab the front of my hoodie. "And what did you do with Natalie?" Isabella was saying. "Where is she?" Behind her, Stephen screamed. An open-mouthed howl of incoherent rage, down at the ground as if imploring it to open up and swallow him alive. Every muscle in his arms and neck and face was pulled tight with tension that had nowhere to go, clenched so hard he was shaking all over. He punched himself in the skull again, heaving for breath through clenched teeth, his eyes bulging out of their sockets, his face turning red. Zheng was right, Evie had warned us that one possible response to the eldritch truth was self-harm. The ultimate rejection of reality, a retreat to the one place the sufferer still had agency, control over causing damage to one's own body. Even if it wasn't conscious or intentional, there was always the risk of harm during some kind of breakdown. And Stephen Skeets was breaking fast. His rage had nowhere to go, directed inward, shoring up the crumbling walls of his reality. This was hardly ideal, but it wasn't a worst-case scenario, not yet. One parent was losing his mind in the anger of rejection. The other was clinging so hard to the promise of her daughter that she'd rendered herself capable of ignoring what lay in front of her own eyes. But I couldn't afford mercy. These two had to break before I could help reconstruct them. I filled my lungs and raised my voice. "Your daughter is." But I trailed off in fresh horror. Isabella, stately and fey, perhaps tall and proud in better times, with the willowy body of a dancer and her long dark hair flowing down her back, lowered herself to her knees before me. She put her hands together and bowed her head in prayer. "Please," she sobbed. Tears ran down her cheeks, dripping onto the rock. "Please. I'll do anything. Anything. Please. What do you ask of me? Please, please, please." I stared down at her in horror, then had to swallow a hiccup. My act had been too good, too convincing, perhaps too real. She was begging me, imploring me, treating me as the outsider godling daughter that I had been unwittingly presenting myself as. We hadn't planned for this, Evie hadn't predicted this, I had no contingency in place for being worshipped. Stephen fell to his knees too, but not in supplication. He screamed at the ground, strings of drool leaking from between clenched teeth, so red in the face that he must have been close to bursting a blood vessel. His screaming must have carried for miles through the gray swamp around us. "No," I whispered. "I didn't mean I'm not." That bitter slice of my heart laughed with spiteful hate. "How does it feel, casting yourself on the mercy of something inhuman? How does it feel to be lost?" This was a worst-case scenario beyond anything I had prepared for. What had I expected? That this was going to unfold like Nicole's initiation into the occult truth. Nikki had already been primed, though none of us had known it at the time, back when we'd ended up with her bound and gagged in our old sitting room. A police detective who had already begun the long, slow, torturous process of turning against the illusions of her own profession, disgraced and discarded by a bureaucracy that cared nothing for her very real ideals of justice, she was already partway there, a seeker after the truth behind the veil, even if that truth was worse than she'd ever imagined. And Shuja, the father of Amy Stack's little boy, Evelyn had been right about him too. He'd seen his society pulled apart by unimaginable violence and destruction. He'd seen all comfortable realities fall away in the face of another kind of truth. He'd been primed for this, too. To accept the truth without going mad, one had to already be a little bit broken. But Natalie's parents were ordinary people. Maybe they'd never questioned their beliefs before. Never doubted. Never wondered. Never looked up. And I had just unmoored them from reality. Shaman, Jing purred. I know, I hissed back. I don't know what to do, I. Call for your yellow godling, shaman. Pull the ripcord. Now. I turned to look up at Jing, turned away from Isabella. Who cared about the illusion of power anymore? But the poor woman went on babbling out her prayer to me, clutching her hands together so hard that she was tearing her own flesh with her nails. Please, please, whatever you are, whatever you want me to call you, please, return my daughter, I'll do anything, I'll give anything. I believe, I never did before but I do now, please, please, anything, anything. Stephen rocked back and forth on the ground, screaming, spittle drooling from his chin, heaving for each breath between his incoherent animal noises. He started speaking too, but it was nothing but wordless rage at the world collapsing around him. I can't. I said to Zheng. Sevens was meant to wait until it was right, until it was time to show them the shambler, but. Zheng grunted, taking a step forward. It is too late, shaman. We have failed. Wait. Wait. I reached for Zheng's arm, to hold her back from drastic action. I had no idea what she was about to do, shake the parents apart, throw them into the swamp, kill them as a failed experiment. And then a voice whispered in my ear. Like sunlight through golden honey, like the trickle of warm wine through ears of wheat beneath the baking summer sky, like butter melted by body heat. Embrace it, said. 7 shades of sunlight. I froze. Luckily for Natalie's parents, so did Zheng, rather than continuing forward to throw Stephen into the swamp, or whatever other violence she'd been about to inflict. What? I whispered back. I half turned to look over my shoulder. Sevens wasn't actually there, not as a physical presence, a human mask like usual. Nothing stood on the rock behind me. But I felt a warmth press against my back, like the gentle pressure of sunlight on cloth and skin. A breath tickled my ear, as if inside the private confines of my squid skull mask. Gentle hands, immaterial and soft and firm, took my wrists and held me up. Embrace what they think you are, whispered 7 shades of not really there. But I'm not. You are the daughter of a god, she whispered like gold over hidden thunder. You are betrothed to a god. You walk the long path to apotheosis, and we are your disciples. Embrace it. These people need it, or they will not return from the pit. Inside my mask, I gritted my teeth. I'm not a god. Sevens, stop. No, but to them, right now, you need to be one. I can't. I don't want to be worshipped. Sevens, I'm not a god, or a messiah, or a... Not to me, not to us, she whispered. Not to those close to your heart. But to those beyond, you could be. This is your role, my beloved. These people need a God, a merciful one, to deliver them from evil. Little Natalie needs a God to save her parents from themselves, to mend the break in reality. Embrace it, and they will pull through. I almost sobbed. I can't. I'm just me. Here, whispered Golden Truth. I will guide you. A familiar soft embrace flowed up and over my shoulders, wrapping me in liquid sunlight and silk Seven's cloak, the mantle of her love, the piece of herself that she'd given to me as protection from the eye, and which I'd asked her to hold for me since we'd returned together from her father's house. The yellow robe, the marriage promise, proof of divinity. Ah yes, just what I needed to prove I wasn't an outsider god, a full-body halo of glowing light that Natalie's parents had no explanation for. Isabella must have seen the glowing cloak, because she raised her head at last. She looked up at me in awestruck rapture. Stephen stopped screaming, his wild eyes rolling until they found me. Zheng stepped back, gave me room. And Sevens raised my arms, spreading them wide, her invisible touch gifting me the poise and pose of something I was not. She whispered to me again, embrace it. Tell them the truth. What truth? I hissed through clenched teeth. That you have already saved their daughter. Pull them from the pit, they will never climb out by themselves. Behind my squid skull mask, I opened my mouth. I was not an outsider godling, no matter how certain people kept looking at me. I was not a daughter in waiting, held in reserve for the mantle of the eye to fall across my shoulders. I was not a savior or a messiah or something to be worshipped, no matter how Badger or Zheng looked at me. I was just me, Heather Morel, born in reading, a weird scrawny English girl who read too many books and wanted to kiss ladies. But here I was, standing on the lip of an alien swamp, with two people desperately in need of salvation. And I'd put them there, I had brought them to this. They were now my responsibility. I realized, in that brief pause, that we had attracted quite an audience. The Shambler had returned, perhaps drawn by Stephen's screaming, or by the departure of Sevens from her original task. She was standing about 40 feet away from the little rock outcrop, waist deep in the swamp waters, beneath one of the strange, twisted trees. In both massive knobbly hands she held half a cow carcass, dragging it through the waters behind her like a child with an oversized pillow. She was gnawing on one end of the thing, chewing through meat and cracking bones with her anglerfish teeth. Lozzie's gift, lifted from the back of a Sherrowford butcher's shop via the untraceable magic of the slip, and then delivered via Sevens wearing my face, the highest class delivery girl in all outside. But she wasn't alone. Dimensional shamblers were everywhere. They lurked behind the thick boughs of the twisted trees, or eye-deep in the muck, or crouched on low rises of drier ground further out. Most were partially submerged, showing only the black discs of their massive eyes and the tops of their leathery heads, or crouched so one could see their shoulders humped like gray mud amid the gray waters, well camouflaged in the depths of the swamp. A few larger specimens stood tall and unmoving, impossible to see if you didn't know what you were looking for. Dozens of them. I hadn't sensed them arriving, either appearing out of nowhere or wading through the waters. Some were clustered within arm's length of each other, family groups or rough alliances. Some were small, shorter than myself children. Many of them were scarred in minor ways, with old chloraks down their hides or on their forearms. A few were missing digits or even a limb here and there. Two particularly massive shamblers stood very close to each other, actually touching, and they were terribly scarred with old battle wounds. One of them was even missing an eye. The other carried something in a fist a length of steel pipe. Stainless steel, not rusted by the swamp waters. Now where had he gotten that from? Almost every shambler had a hunk of raw beef off the dead cow Sevens had brought here. They had shared. Despite that, each group kept their distance from the others, like rival predators gathering at a watering hole, in witness to a brief truce. Or to witness a revelation. What might one do with an army of these creatures? And they weren't the only things watching. Further off through the tangle of gray trees, I could just about make out the vast outline of some gray leviathan, some wallowing swamp dweller with a neck that could stretch higher than the trees, currently surfaced from a life of mud burrowing, paused to listen to this godling seed who had appeared in its swamp. Further out, past the tall trees to the right, I could feel the attention of something up in that stone tower. I had such an audience. Temptation seized my guts and my throat, trying to squeeze words out of me. I wouldn't even have to think very carefully about what exactly to say, because my audiences were primed and ready. Out in the swamp, I had brought a bounty of fresh meat, and asked nothing in return. I had fed a multitude so used to long starvation and stringy meat. Closer at hand, Isabella and Stephen were begging for the deliverance of their child, and I was about to answer their prayers. At my side, Jing already had faith, even if she didn't call it that out loud. At my back, 7 shades of sunlight lifted me up with true outsider divinity. My tentacles strained and strobed. My trilobe reactor ran hot in my gut. So much potential. All I had to do was speak. Standing on a fulcrum that I might move with the lightest touch. For a moment, I almost believed it myself. After all, the eye had taught me the language of the gods, the keys to shape reality, hyperdimensional mathematics. I had dived into the abyss and returned as more than human. I had faced down the worst that outside had to offer. I was clad in royal yellow, on the cusp of something greater. Here was the beginning of a real cult, transdimensional, ready to worship what they did not understand. And I would be a gentle deity, a kind godling. I would never push my flock to self-destruction. I knew I could never do that, it wasn't in me. How much better could I protect my friends, if I had a real cult at my back? How many willing souls to throw themselves into the task of recovering my sister? How much security could I buy, for the price of this one lie? That spiteful, bitter part of me reared up in triumph, smashing the bottle inside my chest, a serpent in my heart. I will make them see. I will make them believe. They lied to me and locked me in a mental hospital and told me she wasn't real, for years. I'm right. I know I'm right. And who would object? Rain. Rain's words echoed in my memory, total acceptance of whatever I might become, back when we'd first gotten together. So maybe you learn to cut through solid steel with your mind, or command demons, or fight a god, but at the end of the day you're still gonna need a hug. You're still going to be shorter than me, and I'm still going to be able to pick you up and princess carry you, and you can't do a thing about it. Lozzie. Lozzie was already halfway to godlike herself, barely human, and I accepted her fully, totally, anything she decided to become. Surely she would do the same for me. Homo abyssus was the truth. I was the truth. Nobody could complain if I just pretended, and then over time pretend might become real. No, it was already real, I was. I was inviting Evelyn's disappointment. That was like a bucket of cold water over my head. All the quivering potential collapsed into ugly ashes, and suddenly I was just Heather Morel again, sweaty and sticky inside a mask of bone, terrified of failure. What was I thinking? Set myself up as a god. That was the path taken by so many mages before, the path that led to people like Alexander Lilban, or to entities like Urinju. I was not a thing to be worshipped, I was not an object, I was just Heather Morel, no matter how good I could be for my friends. Evelyn would take one look at me acting like that, and slap me across the face. And I would deserve it. These two were not my parents. This wasn't my fight. It wasn't for me. That shut the bitter voice up, for now. But I still had to speak. If I wasn't very, very careful, I was about to found a religion out here. No matter how much these two needed it, I had to tread carefully, or I was going to hand an entire race of outsider sapients a god powered by exhaustion, caffeine, and painkillers. No. I snapped, and shook my arms free of Seven's embrace. 7 shades of sunlight stumbled on the rock surface behind me, an audible clack-clack of smart shoes on stone. A quick glance back showed the yellow princess, now physical and fully embodied. She sighed gently and gave me a slightly ruffled look, like a tropical parrot who'd been picked up unexpectedly. Kitten, she warned me softly. Stop. I hissed back. Stop, right now. The shaman says stop, Jing purred. Seven shot her a sharp look. For a moment the two otherworldly ladies locked eyes with each other, but then Sevens looked away first, with a tiny huff. Zheng cracked her neck from side to side, thrumming with hidden tension. I turned back to Natalie's parents. They were looking rather confused at this exchange, not to mention Seven's suddenly appearing out of nowhere. She probably looked like she'd just stepped out of thin air behind me. More proof of strange miracles, the last thing I needed right now. I faced Isabella and Stephen, lowered my tentacles from their sunburst spread, and killed the yellow glow of the princess's mantle, smoothing it over my shoulders, just yellow fabric now. I have already rescued your daughter, I said, clearing my throat to make my voice more normal. Natalie is in a safe place. I can take you there in a moment. And Termy, he's okay too. Yes, I saved the cat as well. Or, well, he sort of saved himself. Isabella lit up with the internal glow of true rapture, crying openly now, babbling. Thank you. Thank you, yes, thank you. Stephen shook his head in shock, consciousness rising from the depths of animal rage. But he turned toward me too, lowering his head in mute submission. No. I snapped again, hard and angry. Isabella fell silent, stumbling over a bitten-off word, waiting for my instructions. Stephen flinched and half-raised his head. I need you to believe, I said. But not in me. Stop that. I need you to believe in where you're standing, in the evidence of your own eyes. I need you to stop looking at me. Look around. Isabella swallowed, hard and difficult, suddenly struggling to breathe. There it was, the buried horror which her spontaneous faith had been concealing. Stephen sighed like all the strength went out of him, sagging with denial, hanging his head. Back to square one. I swore quietly, inside the privacy of my squid skull mask. Keep going, said Sevens, quiet and soft, a voice at my back. This is real, I said. And I need you to accept that. Your little girl needs you to accept that. Try. Isabella drew in a sobbing breath. No, I. Why, said Stephen. Good question, Jing purred. Shaman. I only had one tactic left. With both hands and one tentacle, I reached up and hooked my squid skull mask off my head, exposing my face. Dank swamp air stuck to my skin, the stench of sulfur and salt filled my nostrils, and my exhausted eyes suddenly stung with the sheer weight of this long, long day. I wiped my hair back out of my face and clung to Zheng's side with two tentacles, just for the extra support. Then I hiccuped, loudly and painfully. Ow, I sighed. Natalie's parents stared at me like they were seeing a space alien stepping down the ramp of a starship. Their brief vision of God had a human face. Why? I echoed. I tried to address them directly, but I couldn't stick to it. My eyes wandered off, looking at the loose ring of shamblers, at the distant horizon of the swamp, at the vast trees off to our right, and up at the tower. Something was watching from up there, no doubt, and it had not turned away when I'd revealed my humanity, or what was left of it. Stephen gathered himself. You're just a girl. A young woman, I mean. Sevens clicked her tongue. Smart, this one, isn't he? Jin grunted. The shaman is the shaman. Why? I echoed again. Because once upon a time, something similar happened to me, when I was 9 years old. A little younger than Natalie right now, yes. They nodded. I continued. I was kidnapped, taken outside, by something from out here. Not this dimension, but another one, a much worse place. My parents didn't believe me, and why should they? You too can barely believe, and you're seeing it with your own eyes. I am trying, Isabella whispered. Her husband nodded, but he was still frowning, still needed more. Try harder, monkey, said Zheng. I carried on. I spent years in and out of mental hospitals. The doctors diagnosed me with schizophrenia, but they were wrong. All because of something that really did happen. Do these look like a hallucination to you? I pointed at my own tentacles. I felt them, Isabella said. I felt them, when you touched. So, when I saved your daughter from death by exposure or starvation out here, I saw myself reflected in her. You want her to grow up healthy, don't you? You want her to have a chance at a peaceful, fulfilling life. You don't want her to doubt her every thought, her every experience. They were nodding along now. I had them, somehow, even though this wasn't what I'd expected or wanted. I needed them to acknowledge the swamp, outside, not me. I wasn't important here. But I spoke on. Then you need to see and believe. Don't look at me. Certainly don't bloody well worship me. Look at where you are. Look, and stop denying the evidence of your own eyes. Stop trying to rationalize it away or mythologize it into something palatable. Stephen screwed up his eyes and gritted his teeth. For a moment I thought I'd failed, I'd lost him to that final denial. Look up, I said. For Natalie. In the end, Isabella went first. Hesitating, confused by her own internal reactions, she finally stopped pressing her hands together in prayer, and looked away from me. After a moment, Stephen did the same, raising his eyes from the rock to the sky. It took them a long time to get to their feet, but they got there in the end. They held hands and sobbed quietly for a while, but they did their best to look, even if they struggled, even if it hurt. Sevens and Zheng and I watched them adjust, staying out of the way of something which, in the end, was none of our business. As long as they accepted it, that was all that mattered. Eventually, Isabella pointed at one of the shamblers. She could probably only see the eyes, floating in the swamp muck. What is I can see something, what is that? Just some friends, I said. I think they came to watch the show. Is it over now? Stephen asked. It's never over, I sighed, staring up at that distant tower, wondering who was also watching. Once you're in for good. And your daughter is in, whether anybody likes it or not. She adjusted, she survived out here alone for nearly 24 hours, and she kept her mind together, and kept her little cat from getting hurt, too. Though, maybe Termy kept her from getting hurt, I don't know for sure. That does sound like Termy, Isabella said. He's a good boy. They still won't fight for her, said that bitter voice in my chest. The moment you leave their world, they'll revert. I looked back down at the pair of them, these two cowering apes who I had exposed to the inhuman truth with such cruelty. They were barely holding together, their sense of reality in tatters. I had them in the palm of my hand. I could shape them any way I wanted. That bitter voice demanded revenge. But none of this was about me. So, are you in? I asked. Are you on your daughter's side, or not?